Ladies and gentlemen, good morning. What's up? Today's episode is brought to you by, you guessed it, Black Rifle Coffee. Go to blackriflecoffee.com and check out what they have. Right on the top banner, let's just go through it right now. Subscriptions to a coffee service. You could do, holy cow, there's a lot. Exclusive merch, coffee club, exclusive coffee subscription, sticker, prepaid stuff. Then there's coffee, then there's apparel, then there's gear, clearance stuff. You know, I don't know what to tell you other than if you have time and a credit card, blackriflecoffee.com. In addition to that, they make delicious coffee. And it's a brand founded by people I couldn't have more respect for. And that's why I couldn't be prouder to be involved with them. My guest today is someone that I received a ton of messages about. His name is Matthew Cole. He is a journalist and an author. His most recent book is called Code Over Country: The Tragedy and Corruption of SEAL Team 6. I think a lot of people would think that I would not want to sit down and have a conversation with this person, or that we would not be capable of sitting down and having a conversation. But the reality is, I think it was fantastic. We talked for over 3.5 hours, but I'll just say nearly 4. That sounds more impressive. Before writing this book, it wasn't the first time, I should say. He has written about the U.S. military. He was an investigative producer for ABC and NBC News, traveled Afghanistan and Pakistan, covering conflicts, reporting on U.S. intelligence operations. He's written some articles for The Intercept, and like I said, his most recent work. So I'm going to go ahead and stop talking and get into the conversation. Episode number 227 with Matthew Cole. Enjoy.
Okay, got the red smoke. Gun run, north or south, west of the smoke, west of the smoke. Okay, copy, west of the smoke. I'm looking at danger close now. Come on with it, baby, give it to me, I need it. Get cleared hot. Copy, cleared hot.
I got a substantial amount of messages, people saying that you have to come on the show. And I'll be honest with you, I'm not sure why, because I don't know how they think a conversation between you and I would go. I try to be honest and transparent about my experiences. I'm highly critical of my own experiences. I'm pretty critical of the veteran community pretty often, and I'm also very critical of the SEAL community. I don't know if they thought you and I were going to have an argument, which I don't want to do. Conversation for me would be much better. I read the book. I'll tell you up front, I think there were some hits and there were some swings and misses. But at the end of the day, like I said, I'm not sure what people think. They demanded, you have to have this guy on. And I listened to the Team House, correct? I almost said Team Room. Team House podcast. And I generally don't do that, actually. When I'm getting ready to have a guest on, I'll just kind of let them come in kind of blank and blind and see how it goes. But yeah, I was curious, so I listened to it. It was a good listen for sure. And I'm glad you're here. Thank you for making the travel out. I was going to ask you, did you have any hesitation or trepidation coming on? Because, I mean, I obviously come from the background of somebody that you were writing about, but...
No, not really. I mean, I had listened to a few of your episodes, as I mentioned before we started talking, you said some things that I really responded well to. I think you have a very open-minded approach, engaging all of these subjects, and that's enough for me, your audience. I want them to engage with the book. I want them to buy the book. I want them to read the book. I don't mind sparring at all. I mean, what I put in what's on the pages, or something I stand behind, and, I'm not worried about disagreements. No, I actually, it's just a great opportunity. I mean, I think that it's not every day that you get to sit down with someone who served in the unit, who's doing something closer to what I do now, and willing to talk about these things. I mean, the great thing about podcasts is you get to talk about something at length, and you get to go down some real rabbit holes.
We're going to do stopwatch, 30 seconds maximum for complicated topics.
Okay. Well, I as to whether I had any reservations, I had a moment where I thought maybe I'm going to get, knifed in the neck with a pen.
It's not my style.
But in reality, I was sort of like, I need an excuse to go out to Montana and get 2 days away from my family and kids. It's not that hard of a sell, to be honest.
Had you ever been up here?
No, I've been to Missoula once for reporting, but I have, it's funny because I got off the plane and there's a smell, and it must be First of all, I'm a city boy. I grew up in the center of Chicago, and then I went from there to New York, and I've been there for over 20 years. So I'm not a rural person, and I don't have a whole lot of experience in the woods. And when I was in Afghanistan and Pakistan as a reporter in 05, 06, starting in 05, was the first time I had ever seen big mountains ever in my life.
Really?
Yeah, I'd never been.
The Hindu Kush was the first mountain range you checked out.
That is a factual statement. It is true.
That would be like the first thing well, in my opinion, the first piece of art you stand in front of is like the Mona Lisa. Everything's kind of downhill after that.
Well, but that was actually the kind of experience. But so there's like this whole, like the big sky country, I didn't know anything about. I mean, I've never, you and I couldn't be more different in that I have never skied in my life.
Yeah.
And I've never surfed. Actually, I have surfed now as an adult. I tried it and I hurt my leg, and I've never surfed
Surfing?
again.
You hurt your leg?
I had a long story. I hurt my knee on trying to learn, for 2 days. But I've never surfed. I've never skied. I've never done those things. I grew up literally as a hood rat in the city of in the center of Chicago, and so when I got off the plane here, and it's happened to me once or twice before out west. I get off a plane, you can smell a place. That's always the first thing that happens for me. I smell a place. And I don't know if it's cedar. I don't know what tree it is. There's a tree, though. I was hit with a smell when I got off the plane and out of the airport last night that was very similar to trees that I must have smelled in Afghanistan, because it took me right back. And I was like, you look out, there's no way you could land here and not look at this and go, God is amazing. I'm not even talking about religiously. I'm just,
yeah. The fact that this exists.
Yes, the fact that this exists. So, for me, it's just exciting to get a chance to get a breath of fresh air, hit a mountaintop or a little trailhead and.
You know what it might be is, so right now, it's Montana. I've only lived here for about 5 years, but it has this period of time where it's really slow coming out of the winter season. And then it launches. And right now we're kind of in that. And not everybody, a lot of people do their spring burn pit or burn pile right now. Yeah. So there's a lot of wood burning. And, from your time in Afghanistan, I mean, we're talking wood fires. So it's probably, in the valley itself, if you notice, in the time after the podcast, before we leave tomorrow, we're kind of in a valley, and it pushes everything down a little bit. Yeah. So it might be, because I actually really enjoy it too when you walk out by the baggage claim. Like,
yeah. Yeah, no, it was really, but excuse me, it is, it's a weird experience to see the Hindu Kush as your first mountain range and go, hey, this whole mountain thing is kind of nice. It's 14,000 feet is a glorious place to stand up at and look down on, beneath you. And I just had never, I had never been to any of the states out here.
Yeah. I love the Hindu Kush, but I also hate it because I had to walk all over that damn thing.
There's a reason. Look, there's a reason why it's called Kush, right? I mean, it's a killer. It's literally, it's an inhospitable place.
Except for the people who live there, who are able to literally and figuratively carve their survival out of the side of those mountains.
Yeah, although, we
have to define survival.
Let's not overrate things. They live a very tough life. Yeah. There as well, for even by their own standards, and it's just it's inhospitable for groups bigger than 150. It just doesn't bode well for any kind of centralized living. And
with their view though, they could see flat ground. It's like, this generation, we're moving.
It's funny. I remember one of the things I always remember. Soldiers, when I was embedded with the 10th Mountain, saying when I was up in Nuristan and Kunar, was, if we weren't in a war, I could see this place being a ski resort. And I was like, have you seen anyone around here wearing skis?
No.
I was like, it doesn't translate. I said, I know what you're saying, but it's not, it doesn't translate. No one's skiing around here.
No, if they had all the off time in the world, they would not ski.
No.
The Western lens doesn't apply very well sometimes.
Yeah, sometimes you just have to check all of your experiences out the window when you go to a place far away where they do things very differently, and just sort of try to absorb as much as you can about, the way they see it.
For sure. How'd you get into journalism?
I can't add or subtract or count to start with. So
that makes two of us at this table.
I was wanted to write. I couldn't hack it doing fiction. I couldn't make things up. I always thought that.
Did you try?
In college a little bit, but mostly I didn't even try because I knew I couldn't formulate it out of my head. There was always a stumbling block, whereas nonfiction narrative seemed a little more natural. And then I went to grad school and sort of floundered for a couple months, and then I was at Columbia School of Journalism for 9/11, and had been down at the Trade Center the morning of, from about 5 a.m. to about 8 a.m. And that was a pretty formative experience, going through that as a New Yorker. And then as a fledgling journalist, I really, really realized that I wanted to understand what had just happened, what had been happening. And as we moved quickly into going into Afghanistan, I wanted to get to Afghanistan as quickly as I could. It took me a while, but it lasered. I had a laser focus at that point to understanding all of the unseen parts of U.S. policy and U.S. activity that, surely was part of things that had led up to the attacks themselves, and were going to follow the attacks, because it was clear that from the U.S. perspective, the world really had changed. So that was really it. And then I came out I graduated and I was a freelancer. I was totally unemployable. And I just sort of hustled for freelance gigs in magazine writing, and sort of eventually found myself in this little niche of national security reporting.
So you were still in grad school, and you found a way to get embedded overseas in Afghanistan?
No.
Okay.
Afghanistan, it took me a while to get to, actually.
Because I'm actually fascinated by that process too. How somebody goes from the desire to doing that to finding themselves up in Kunar, which is some of the most inhospitable terrain that I've been in.
I'll tell you, I'll mark it out for you, because it's an interesting experience going from that, and it I think it illuminates, at least for me, how difficult it was. It was not easy. 9/11 happened. I remember then October 7th or November 7th? You'll have to, maybe you can correct me. It's either November 7th or October 7th. The U.S. started airstrikes in Afghanistan.
I don't know.
2001. And I was, one of the assignments for our class was we had to go out and interview New Yorkers, sort of a man on the street interview. You find a stranger, you ask them what they think about the fact that, the U.S. is now fighting in Afghanistan. By the time I graduated in April, May of 2002, we were well, into the start of the war, and it was also becoming clear that we were probably going to be going into Iraq as well. And I really thought, what I would like to do is I would like to teach journalism to Afghans who are coming out of 20 years of civil war and 10 years roughly of oppressive Taliban rule. And so I was trying to figure out a way to get involved, almost like an NGO, where I'd go in and teach that, they had a civil society that didn't allow for journalism, that in any way that we would imagine it, in any way that I just had gone through schooling for. And I thought that's something that I could do to contribute, and is, an important part of building a civil society, a new, open, non-Taliban Afghanistan. I mean, obviously these are the delusions of grandeur of a 22-year-old who...
I like it, though. You were aiming big.
I was,
Their First Amendment is a little bit different than ours, as is their literacy
But,
rate.
I was going to go... I really wanted to teach them the First Amendment. And and anyway, I couldn't find any organization that was doing it. What I didn't know at the time was, if I had just jumped on a plane, I could have gone into Kabul and just done it. I mean, it was... I ended up knowing all these reporters and people who were in NGOs who were there in the first 2-3 years, and understood how wide open everything was at the time. But it took me a long time. And so it wasn't until 2005 where I went on a reporting trip through northwest Pakistan, and went, it was just myself and a couple of friends, with someone who was from a very special, hard to find place in the Northwest Frontier Province, as it was called then, right along the border with Nuristan. And that really opened my eyes. And I had this experience where I was interviewing local Pakistanis about, they were a 6-hour walk from the border, 6 to 8 hour walk from, not the border, but from the next town in Nuristan over the border. And I was sort of asking them, do you see any signs of war? This is 2005, and summer of 2005. Do you see any signs of airstrikes, of planes and helicopters and any evidence? And they were like, no, there's a little more activity of, Pakistani military or outsiders coming and going through the valley to get over to the border and across and out, both ways. But otherwise, nothing. And I thought, that's so fascinating that they have this border that was conceived of by a drunken Brit, a couple hundred years ago, that was a dividing line. It was an invisible line between a war and what was otherwise no difference in their life for 100 years prior, right? There was no indication where I was in northwest Pakistan that there was a war going on across the road, if you will. And I just thought, that's wild. I just couldn't imagine it. And so I was like, well, I need to now see the other side. I've got to get to the other side of that line and see what it looks like in Nuristan for the Afghans and what their reality is. And at that time, the only way to get up into that area was to embed. And so, and post 9/11, that was the only way, basically, that journalists were covering either of the wars. You just had to. There weren't, it was, the death of Daniel Pearl from, when Al-Qaeda and KSM killed him. That was, it was more than just an individual tragedy. It was psychological warfare that was meant to send a message to the Western world, but the press, that no one is safe. They beheaded him, correct? Yes. Yeah. And he was, chasing a very dangerous story, but he just, he did nothing wrong. He was, it was just pure nihilism. And in that case, I would say savagery. But it was a message that reporters were not safe. And certainly the message that I took, and a lot of people who were journalists, younger journalists at my peer range took. And so, you wanted to go in with the military. And so so my point is that that's a 4-year period between the time I left grad school and the time that I ended up getting to the front gates of Bagram. And at that time, I had done enough magazine stories that I was clearly a real journalist. So you do what you call the front office of the Pentagon, public affairs, and you say, it's literally, that's what you do. Go on the, on the,
I can't imagine calling the Pentagon for anything. That's why I'm laughing.
It took a while. It's not, there's no straight line. I can tell you that. And you, I told them what I wanted to do and where I wanted to go. And I specified which region I wanted to go. And at that point, I had talked to enough reporters to understand, okay, well, if I want to be up in Kunar and Nuristan right now in this current year, you need to be with the 10th Mountain or with these guys, right? And so,
and for people listening, I'll say broadly, if you want to get a documentary that shows portions of that area, I would say Restrepo,
right? And
to give them a visual idea of kind of the area we're talking about.
Absolutely, and actually at that time, those Kunar valleys, whether it was the Pesh or
because they're neighboring, Kunar and Pesh are neighboring.
Yeah. There were too many embeds at the time. They were small outposts, and there were too many reporters in those spaces at the time, and so I couldn't fit. So I had to sort of stick with what they were giving me, and I was really glad that I did, because it was from a journalist, from a perspective of a reporter, and just as a person, it was a really, really transformative experience for me to witness a low intensity conflict at 9,000 and 10,000 feet above altitude, above sea level. Yeah. And understanding both the challenges, but also in some ways the insanity of what the U.S. military thought that it was trying to do or could do there. So my point is that there was a 4-year gap, or it took 4 years for me to figure out how to make my way to Bagram. But I did. I've always been a big believer that, you're better off biting off more than you can chew and learning how not to choke. It may not be artful chewing, it may not be pretty, but you learn from your failures. I've done that. I think, honestly, I've done that almost my entire career. I learn the hard way how to do things, and
I've discovered it's the only way I know how to learn.
well, but that's
I do less with books and more stubbing my toe and learning to lift my foot up.
Yeah, I mean that's figuratively that is what I was doing, and but it was it was great. I mean it was some of the best experiences as I said journalistically, but also a lot of what I think I was just telling this to a colleague the other day who I was sort of not urging, but I was suggesting that may be interested in going to Poland or Western Ukraine to start reporting on the conflict there, that, ultimately the job is bearing witness, right? Journalists bear witness. That's the most fundamental. I mean, there's lots of different iterations and there's different things you do, but bearing witness is one of the most fundamental things, right? And when your country goes to war, I didn't serve, I didn't sign up, I didn't volunteer, but I care a lot about what the U.S. is doing in terms of policy and how it conducts itself abroad and how other countries interact. And so I can't not participate. I have to see what's happening for myself before I can speak about it. I mean, that's basically it. It's like I can't form an opinion about something that I have no experience with. And so the best I can do is try to immerse myself in it and see things as best I can. There are inherent limitations, right? But and so that was a really important experience for me and my evolution as a reporter.
Did they? So in my entire career, I think I was around. Oliver North came out when I was on deployment in 2010. And I remember walking into the chow hall. Like, I think that's Oliver North. I'm going to go sit over there. Because he was actually open that he was writing a book. But that was the only time I ever had any exposure to a journalist overseas. And he was in the back of an Mi-7. They landed him in a low ground position that ended up sweeping through a valley. What I will say is that there were better than not odds we were going to encounter no resistance into the target that he was taken on. I was in a high ground position, so I was not physically on the ground. However, I was involved in the planning process, so I can say with a pretty high level of certainty we were going to be okay. I'm sure it made a great story for his book. But when you ended up in Kunar with those elements, are you just living amongst them? Is it a full doors are wide open, you can be as involved as you want? I'm curious to the level of would you go out on patrol with them?
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. That's a good question. There's no simple answer. I'll walk through it. So I'll do it based on where I started first. After I got myself from Bagram to Naray, okay, you had three elements in Naray. You had 10th Mountain, it's sort of conventional. Mm-hmm. Then you had ODA, SF, and then you had OGA, right, in a corner. And basically, the rules were ODA and OGA were totally off limits. You don't look at them. You don't acknowledge them. They're not here.
What a great way to draw attention to something.
It's phenomenal, actually. It's phenomenal.
Fucking idiots.
It's phenomenal. Well, the funny thing is that I knew so much at that point about the agency, the CIA's personnel in Afghanistan for 20 years, that one of the guys who was there I knew about. I mean, I knew who he was. I knew his whole background. Through talking to others. And I at some point I actually came up to him and said, we know some people in common. He basically was like, go fuck yourself, which is fair. That's his right. But,
that's a templated answer.
But it's, the best way to draw attention is
say, don't look over there.
Yeah, no, you don't see any of those weapons.
I'm going to leave for a week, and there's a box in the corner. Whatever you do, don't go unwrap the box and look in it.
So they gave you pretty good with the 10th Mountain element. The conventional army, they gave you pretty good access most of the time. What was interesting was that they housed you in the tent that you were in Naray in particular, was for journalists, some Terps, and then guys who were augmenting different units coming through. So they were not permanent.
Interesting.
And so like there was a guy there, I remember, I guess in retrospect, he was a CCT. And he slept. I mean, I remember when he first came in like at an odd hour in the night, and he slept literally on his cot for like 48 hours straight. And when he was up and I started talking to him, it was because he had been out somewhere in a mountain sitting for 6 days, putting laser
Designating targets.
And hadn't slept. I mean, he literally had not slept in 6 days. So he was just trying to recover, and then with the Terps, that was the best experience I could have possibly had, and one that became a template for what I was doing for the rest of my trip, which was that everywhere I went, every one of the bases that I went to in FOBs, the interpreters really, they knew so much. They knew so much, and they were being treated like such shit, sort of at the 50,000 foot level and at the 5 foot level, that I was a sympathetic ear and empathic. And what I started doing was I started having meals with the Afghan forces and the interpreters in their side of the base, sitting down. And I was really lucky because of where we were on the border of it's where Kunar meets Nuristan, which is, for your listeners, it's basically the top northeast corner of Afghanistan that runs along the northwest portion of Pakistan. And I had on my computer 500 photos that one of my good friends had taken on our trip of the people that we had been living with for about a month, in 3 weeks or so, in these 3 very isolated valleys that most Westerners have never seen and have never been to, and most Pakistanis have never been to. And I can tell you about that too, because that's just fascinating. But the people are called Kalash, and but they're related to a group of Afghans that were further up north from where I was in Kunar in Nuristan, and the interpreters and the soldiers who were from that area, they knew everybody. And so I was showing them photos of people that they knew and had known. And so here's this,
You're a rock star to them already.
Well, here's this round-eyed gringo who shows up and is like, hey, here's a picture of me and my buddy Taj, last year in a full shower kameez and, in a beard and a pakal up at 15,000 feet on a peak that they know, right? That breaks a lot of ice.
Yeah.
And so all of a sudden they're telling me a lot about what's going on right here, right now, with the U.S. versus the insurgents and the locals and all of those things. And so I didn't have to rely on what the military was pushing. And it wasn't so much they were pushing, it was a question of what they did let you see, right? So one of the big things was they would let you, the lieutenant colonel, whose name I can't remember now, they let me in on one planning session where he was going through and sort of giving a commander's brief to his men about what they were doing in this area and what they'd be doing for the next couple of weeks. And, it was pretty dry stuff. But what was interesting was not what they were saying. It was interesting is that when I walked out of that room, that tent, and I was talking to some of the lieutenants and captains who were complaining, in month 6 or 7th of their deployment about the fruitlessness of what they were being ordered to do, matched with what the Afghans and the locals were saying about the problems. Basically they were describing the same problem, and they had more in agreement, the guys on the ground on both Afghan and American. Yeah. And you don't have to be a genius to see that's the story, right? That's a story, right? I showed up, I didn't know what my story was. I just was like, I'm going to take a month. I'm going to go to, at the time, my wife, we were dating. I said, I'll be back some point. I'll do my best not to get myself killed. I mean, and I don't know what I'm going to be writing about. I don't know what I'm going to be doing, but I'll find something. And there's a story. The story was really, these 2 very divided groups were saying the same thing, and they were all kids, right? So it's sort of like, what is it that the kids know that the adults don't? Now, were there things going on that OGA and ODA were doing that were far more sophisticated and complex that that the kids didn't know about? Absolutely. And that's part of the story too. And I worked on that for the next trip that I did, and that was more about the ISI and what the Pakistanis were doing and the double game that they were playing, and how much we knew they were playing us.
I'm going to guess 100%.
You know, the guys on the ground were, but the way it worked in Washington was not like that, right? If you were the COS in Kabul, you had a case of Kabulitis, right? The Pakistanis were doing everything against you and thwarting the U.S. effort. But if you were in Islamabad, right, it was the opposite. You had Islamabaditis, right? It was the Taliban had nothing to do with the Pakistan or Pakistani government, or very little. And that was like, that's your bureaucratic fiefdom that goes on probably anywhere in any organization.
Well, it's a nightmare. And from a boots on the ground level, so like, of all the levels of war, strategic, operational, and tactical, I at best was at the bottom rung of the tactical level. But when we would travel around and go up to Kaust, and ISR is showing people walking back and forth across the border, I'm not at a bureaucratic level, but I have an understanding of what's going on here. Like, weird. They just went past an ANA checkpoint without being checked. I wonder. Now, do I have any impact going up, up the bureaucratic ladder? Well, first, I have no interest in going up the bureaucratic ladder, but no impact whatsoever. So, and I've heard people talking about when it comes to the, the bin Laden raid, like, how could he have been so close to their West Point? Well, the answer is they knew he was there.
We're going to get into that, because I will tell you that the one of my big regrets, I could say this now, I guess, I try to, when I do interviews or I don't do much on social media, and I don't like to share opinions. I like to share my facts of what I've gathered. The book represents everything that I felt 100% confident in and could nail to the ground. And anything that was anything less than that, I just withheld it. But the idea that the Pakistanis were not involved in holding bin Laden and aware of where he was and what he was doing is so absurd.
It's like me saying the wall behind you, Matthew, is not blue. It's clearly fucking blue.
To me, one of the great tragedies, my professional tragedies, is that so far I have not been able to report as much as I know about how much involvement the Pakistanis actually had and how much we knew that he was there and that they were holding him, and basically had him in a version of an undeclared waived SAP, essentially. And what went on at the very highest levels about negotiations, about how he was going to be eliminated once the U.S. found out where he was. So
I would
I'm
read
with
the
you.
hell out of that book.
That's a different book.
To go back to what you're saying, though, about the lieutenant colonel in the brief and the overall bigger picture, and there's the lens that's up, and then there's the lens that's down, and then you have the ANA and the young soldiers that are on the ground and the Terps. I had a guy on named Wesley Morgan. The name of this book, I believe, is The Most Dangerous Place, and it was about Pesh.
Yeah, it's a good book.
Well, and for people who haven't read it, you should, because it talks about this merry-go-round of military operations and this merry-go-round of pass down and handoff of information. And maybe information will live about 2 rotational cycles, but even from, I forget what they call them, they're not peacekeeping operations, but it's just, say, building infrastructure, roads. Why does this road end here? The current, battle space commander may have an understanding of it, but the captain, who's at the COP, the combat outpost of the FOB, Forward Operating Base, he doesn't know, because 3 rotations before that, they were trying to move it farther up the valley. And it's amazing how much, looking back on it now, it's like trying to sprint uphill on a sand berm, but they keep putting sand on top of the berm. Frustrating. Frustrating to say the least. So it doesn't surprise me that there was what was being portrayed, and then you talk to the people who have their boots on the actual ground, and they're like, yeah, that's not what's going on here.
I think that the thing for me that I took from it was that what you're describing, which was almost the universal experience of the U.S. Universally the U.S. experience in Afghanistan, and it ended up very sadly and very tragically playing out for 20 years. was something that was known before anyone ever set foot in Afghanistan. And one of the things that is, I think, a weakness in U.S. policy and government is that it operates very ahistorically. It's as if we think we're reinventing the wheel every time. And, the military planners and the civilians who oversee them really do just ignore like basic facts, right? And in Afghanistan, some of the basic facts are geography. And that geography is inhospitable to central government, and it's inhospitable to foreigners as they define it, when they define it. And those two things mean that whatever you're going to try to achieve in Afghanistan, you have to expect that it is extremely limited, and you cannot swing for the fences. There's no such thing. And the question then becomes, well, why? And that's it's a much bigger question. People who are much smarter than me have tried to sift through, but the part that I focus on is the distance between what the U.S. government says it's doing in a place and why, and what's actually happening. And there were always ground truths that could help illuminate and did reveal what the flaw, the fatal flaw was with U.S. policy, let's say in Afghanistan, right? And at that time, it was this, let's open up Afghanistan to U.S. forces and show the outer provinces that the central government of Afghanistan that we back and prop up can make a difference in their lives, right? That's the good spin for it, right? Except that you're talking about places that no central government has ever controlled, period.
In the history of the country.
In the history of, not even before it was a country, right? The history of that part of the world. And so my question is who agrees to that? Who says this is a good idea, we can do it? What kind of hubris do you have to have, right? What kind of, and the thing is the military is filled with really smart people. There are a lot of generals and 3 and 4 stars who knew that was a really bad idea and wouldn't work. But once it's been accepted as the way it's going to go, everyone just gets in line. And then you end up with 20 years of war, and you end up with, kids who lose their lives. Not even, the story I wrote about later was a kid who died, and it was in Jake Tapper's, the book, the movie that Jake Tapper's book was based on, which in this section had used some of my reporting at the time, which was for Salon, which was a West Point kid who I'd befriended at one of the outposts who had to drive, I can't remember what kind of truck it was, but it was a huge, like essentially construction vehicle that they had been using at the FOB to help move things around. And he had to drive this thing from the FOB down to Kunar, to Nure. And, the roads are crap, and the thing flipped, and he lost his life. And he was Ben Keating. That's how it became Cop Keating. Mm-hmm. And after spending all of this time with him, just a few weeks before he ended up dying, you have to ask yourself, what is the point here? What is the lesson that Americans should learn about what this kid's life was about and what he sacrificed and what his family sacrificed? And, first and foremost, it's bearing witness, right? Here's what happened. This is what happened, and this is why it happened with the context that it happened. And, at that time, one of the things that I felt was really lacking in all reporting, Western reporting about the U.S. military and military operations in Iraq and Afghanistan, was the context and the chain of events that start at one place and go all the way down to some kid or kids down at the bottom, right? Most of it is reported because of time constraints and because of some of them are self-imposed media constraints. It's like looking through a straw, right? So the public only sees this very narrow thing with no context. Yeah. And so it does a real disservice to the public because they don't understand. It's not so much that everything is avoidable. Many things are not avoidable in the sense that, things happen and You can't undo them, but you are supposed to learn the lessons from them and figure out what happened, and how do we try not to do this again, or how do we not make that same mistake over again. And it's just all it was my personal first time experience seeing. I had met this young captain, and he was he a captain or a second lieutenant? Captain, I think. And he was very idealistic. He was walking around with this thick book about Alexander the Great and the history of Alexander the Great in the Hindu Kush Mountains. And he was trying to protect his men and get all his men back. And he was confronting his idealism, which he got from going to West Point and believing in America and American exceptionalism, and the futility of what he was being asked to do.
Yeah.
On a small level, but we would sit up and talk about that, at night. And when he died, I was already back in New York. It would have been maybe like 3 or 4 weeks after I had left Afghanistan, and I got a call or a note from someone in the military who had been in the unit saying, we wanted you to know that Keating died. And I said, well, I mean, thank you for telling me, but I'm not, how come you reached out? And they said, well, we saw that you guys had really, sort of bonded, and he had expressed very clearly how much he appreciated the talks that you guys were having. It was a small thing. There was nothing, it was mostly, I'm sure, just breaking up the boredom for him. But, as it is, you've two guys just talking. And it gave me an opportunity to see what the war looked like in a way that was, in some ways, not dramatic, right? He didn't die from an attack, right? He died from counterinsurgency, right? They made living impossible, the Taliban did, and the insurgents. And so he was required to, the guys in Kunar, the unit in Kunar would not come and pick up the vehicle, and they'd heloed it in, I think, and then they wouldn't helo it back. And so it was like, attrition. And so, but they were like, but you've got to get this thing, back to Kunar, right? Why couldn't that thing have just stayed there for, I don't know.
Because somebody said somewhere that it had to go, and the person that made that decision was not directly involved in what would be required, which I actually think, and again, my experience in the military was at the lowest levels. I worry about what you brought up when you first started talking about that, the military planners and the civilians that in some way, shape, or form draw up the plans and then commit American capital to these things. They're not in any way, shape, or form tied to the execution of it.
No.
And I don't know if there's a solution to that, but I think their planning would change is after they came up with the plan. It's like, hey, here's your list of gear you're going to be bringing with you, because you're coming with us. I would like to think that would change things, but I can tell you that when you are making a plan that you don't have to be involved with, it creates that space for error to creep in, and you don't realize the unrealistic nature of, no, this truck has to be returned. It has to go, and there's no why. Like, why? Because I fucking said so. Did you not see the rank device that's on my collar? And that's how people needlessly lose their lives. But I do worry, and this has come up a lot when it comes to people asking me about Ukraine, which I am not an expert on the area at all, so I always answer the same way. I don't know if we should get involved, but what I really hope is that the people who are responsible for committing that human capital do a better job than they've done in the past and actually think about the long-term consequences of committing American forces.
Well, I agree with you completely. My perspective from it is expanded out just slightly, which is ultimately, look, we live in a country where we have a volunteer service, and it means that 1% to 2% of the population serves, and that simply means that
it's even less than that, 0.05,
even less than that. And so the Americans with personal experience of what it means is so far away from the reality, and that we, I think, as a public, has written this sort of blank check to the government, to civilians who are supposed to be in charge and supposed to have oversight and
accountability.
And so what's happened is that the problem for me is look, I think that every politician who signs an order for someone to go into, for U.S. forces to go into war should have the experience of having a family member or having served, in the sense that the public has to understand what the consequences are of just letting this thing go on overseas in some far off place. You know this much better than I, but the thing that was so common to hear of a refrain for 20 years for soldiers of any stripe coming back to the U.S. after deployment was the gulf between what their experience was in these war zones and what America looks like on a day-to-day basis, and how most Americans have not a clue. And yes, you can put flags out, and there are all sorts of bumper stickers. And I'm not begrudging anyone's how they feel that they express their support, but it doesn't mean it ultimately doesn't affect anything, right? The reality is that we send people off to do things in which we don't have an end state or an end game for them, and the U.S. government does not provide a level of support for what comes home with those who served, and to me it's mind-boggling that you can send. I mean, just to get into your former shop, and I take issue with only one thing, that you were at the lowest levels. You were at the lowest levels of
actual warfare. People don't understand that there's layers to the onion.
Yes,
like I'm not sitting at tables where people are, Andy, Afghanistan, go or don't go. I'd be like, what? Let me go get somebody else who's more qualified.
Right.
I'm not even sitting at the table where we're going to go in theater, RC North, RC, none of that. I'm at the table where, hey, Andy, you're going to be the point man today. You are going to figure out the route. So
right.
That's what I meant, is in the overall structure of how warfare plays itself out.
I find myself frustrated. I have, as an American, frustrated and sad that our government does not think about, they think about maybe in some abstract way, but they don't actually do anything about the consequences for those who served. And the thing that blows my mind every time, I can't not be amazed by this, is that units like SEAL Team 6 and Delta post 9/11 experienced more warfare than any group of Americans ever, period. It is totally unprecedented. And so the fact that we don't have, the U.S. military and the U.S. government does not have a thoroughly vetted, tested program, training system, support system that for everyone coming out from that experience is, to me, the definition of insanity, because you are asking all of these men to carry a undue amount of burden. Now, I know you signed up for it. You're talking about the people who want to do these things. But that being said, no one knows what's coming back until you've gone through that experience. And to me, the tragedy is that those who are responsible for thinking about that, who are supposed to be held accountable for the failures, are not. And so there's this, class divide between the officers who rise and the civilians who make their careers off of these units that want success by numbers and by names and, basically by bodies, which, is a pretty conventional way for society to measure whether there's a success in a war when there can be no victory.
Yeah, I think it's the most irrelevant metric, actually. And you hear guys talk about it inside of, it's a threshold that you'll never find in doctrine, but it is a threshold that people talk about. And oftentimes early in your career, especially in a post 9/11 era, you're in a rush to get past it. You know what I think, though, about the government, and to what you're saying about the government not being there to support them on the outside or on the end of the journey, I don't think the government knows what to do. Because I'll tell you why. I think, one, I don't think anybody has any idea what this level of exposure to warfare actually does to people. And I ask especially the guys that I have used to work with, I ask them, and I'll usually ask them on the podcast if they come on, do you think that there should be a limit to the amount of combat exposure that somebody can actually have in their career before they are pulled back? And the answer is almost always the same. They recognize that that would be important, and then the next thing out of their mouth, and I agree with this, is that the person on the ground that you're trying to limit would fight you tooth and nail. So they'd be the first person to be resistant towards it. And I mean, that's neither here nor there, but I think it's interesting. When I got out of the military in 2013, when I got into the military, there was, let's just say the family unit was not discussed. Maybe it showed up on a PowerPoint slide somewhere. By the time I got out in 2013, there were resiliency programs. They were doing third location decompressions. They were doing pre-deployment trips, post-deployment trips, counselors on site. You know, my point in saying all of this is I think that they realized something was going on, but nobody knew exactly what to do. TBI starts coming out, the NICO institutes. And then there's another aspect of this as well that I think is often overlooked. The government, and right now, in addition to what the government can do, there's about 40,000 service-based organizations that are out there ready and willing to help people. The service member themselves has to go seek that help.
Yeah.
They have to go past that threshold of not being ready or willing or able or have any desire to ask for that help, and they have to go find it. Because what I can say is, in the modern era at least, in the 2020s, there's probably more organizations and money out there ready to be spent on them than there are people to spend it on. And some guys and gals, I use the term guys just because that's
loosely.
It's the community of people that
Right.
I worked with. The SEAL training is now open for women to go through it, and if one makes it through, more power to her. So when I use that term, it's not negative. It's just that's what I worked with. You know, some of them are just unwilling or unable because of how they either think about themselves or the position they're in, or they think it's a sign of a weakness. I don't necessarily know what it is, but the emphasis has to be placed on both. They have to. There needs to be a landing net, but you have to jump into it.
Yeah, look, everyone is responsible for their own decisions and behavior in life. I'm not suggesting that we treat or expect that these are children that need to be constantly parented. I think the thing that's surprising is, and it's, you know, I've done considerable amount of interviews with people from SEAL Team 6 about the psychs and the psych program, and I know for a fact that they have some very, very good psychologists who are there doing some very interesting work. But that said, I think it's also very clear, and I don't know what the answer for this is, but that after 20 years, and yes, it did evolve and things got better than, let's say, where it was in, right after 9/11.
I don't even think we could use the term better. They're trying more things.
Right.
I think the long-term effect is still yet to be determined.
But the thing is that if you're talking about the Pentagon, the notion, there's nothing that DOD can't do simply because they have the money and they have the brain power. It's a fact, right? If you can send a missile into space, at a certain trajectory, at a certain speed that can do, all these things, surely you can sort out and look at best practices for a unique problem for Americans, but not unique for humans, right? Which is the exposure to warfare, to up close violence, to trauma, what trauma looks like and does to the brain. And, leaving aside a individual service member's decision to get the help, or the thing that I think about all the time is and because, it was a subject I didn't touch in the book because it's like a red line that I thought was best to be left, but I think about it a lot, is for the families who are living with this silent trauma, this cloud, kids, wives, parents, siblings, friends who cannot, they know there's trauma, but they can't do anything about it. It's just like this thing. And the way that goes affects people for a generation. There are people growing up with the experience. People talked about it, about people whose families, whose fathers and uncles and grandfathers went to war in Vietnam, and what that did within the family, and how the trauma sort of raised itself. And so it's not some unknowable thing, right? It's not Trauma's not unknowable. The problem is we know more about sending a missile into space and
put it into a geosynchronous orbit than we do how trauma impacts individuals, because it's the variables that, and I say this only anecdotally from what I have seen in working in that world. Some people seem to be bulletproof, and some, if you were to use cups as an analogy, there are people who have thimbles and there are people who have redneck guzzlers who are 64 ounces. And the same experience can impact somebody so drastically differently. I think we know far less about the brain and trauma than we do the missile going into space. And it's so variable between people.
But is there not a scenario where the military has the ability to, say, do testing and identify who is who, which is which, and if you are the thimble person, these are options for you to take and do and be prepared for, and something that.
How would you test for that stress?
I don't know. I mean, how do they test for stress in all the other things that they do for preparing guys to accomplish?
Physically painful, arduous.
Well, but it's is it medically any different?
So I'll use BUDS as an example because it's an origin point for Team Guys and speaks to the book. It's physically challenging. Like it's extremely painful. And I think at the end of it, you learn that your brain is, the governing body for your, the governing organ for your body. And pain, although it hurts, doesn't have to necessarily limit your behavior. But there's no complicated decision making in BUDS under pressure. With lethal consequences. There's no weight. I mean, you do an individual test that's underwater. I used to administer that test, and you would watch kids pass out underwater as opposed to coming to the surface, which is a level of commitment that is hard to describe. They're knowing they're like, fuck it, I can't breathe under here, but I'm going to stay because that's how much I want this. Even the training you do outside of the BUDS, where you're going to start, shooting paper targets, where there really still isn't that weight. There's the weight of performance, especially if you have people in the rafters overhead, and then you can do force-on-force type stuff. I don't know how you would test somebody for that capacity of actually being exposed to it, because even the most realistic training that I have been exposed to, and it was about probably midway through my career when I started getting to that, pales in comparison to the actual exposure for it. So I don't know how you would do it.
How do you mean? Say that again. Pales in comparison.
Pales in comparison. Even the most realistic training scenarios paled in comparison to real life. Because at the end of the day, let's say you're sitting on a helicopter and you're going to go you're doing a realistic urban terrain scenario where you have the full contingent of JSOC assets with you. You're sitting on a helicopter with a paint gun. And you're sitting on a helicopter with a paint gun. And more than likely, you're not going to die unless it'd be a catastrophic training accident. So you have fear of being mocked by your peers, and maybe you're an underperformer. So now you're kind of worried about maybe you're going to get ejected. But there's no real, there's no stress of you're on an actual two-way range where the unknown of behind the story, at the end, in the back of your mind, they're just still wax bullets. So I don't know how you would test for what happens when you remove those safety barriers and then you actually step into the breach.
Well, I would imagine that the measuring of it is your first approach, right? You went through NICOR, and they clearly have the ability to measure what's going on in your brain.
For me, I was limited. I have ferrous metal in my body, so I was limited on the imaging. So I actually spent more time just talking to the docs, because especially when it comes to TBI, like they can image your brain and go, you have some white areas. What they can't tell you is this came from these 5 years of service or this came from junior varsity football. So they can tell you that there's, you know what I mean? Like you can,
sure.
What I think would really help, and I hope they're doing this now, entry test, exit test.
Right.
That I think
before and after.
Correct. Because until you do that, it's this is JV football, this is on target.
Right, but that's actually what I was going to say when you were bringing up BUDS, was it seemed to me that since they already do an unbelievable job of making sure kids don't die at BUDS every day, making sure that literally you can bring your body to almost death, but not death.
It does happen, though. A kid just died coming out of Hell Week.
We can talk about that because there's a scandal there.
Is there really?
Oh, yeah.
I know nothing about it other than it actually happened.
Let me ask you this.
Okay.
How many guys that you knew of or suspect during your BUDS class were taking steroids?
Ooh. That's a great question. I know a guy that I went through BUDS who took them afterwards. Man, that wasn't even on my radar when I was going through. I was like 18 years old. I probably, if you would have asked me when I was 18, would have told you it was like a carrot dipped in like peanut butter. I was very obtuse when it came to those things. And there was much less information about the training. I would be surprised if anybody was, just given the body types. Things have changed, though, and the amount of information that people can get and what they think they're getting themselves into. And it's one of the things that I actually agree with you very much on, is that this loudspeaker and spotlight on the SEAL brand, in my personal opinion, I need to be very clear about this throughout the course of this podcast. I only speak for myself. I don't speak for the SEAL community. And I'll be, as we get through the book, I'll be very clear about if I do know any of the guys, I'll let you know for sure. And then I can tell you what I've heard about and was never around. So I'll always be clear about those things, just so people listen. And quite frankly, one of my main criticisms of the SEAL community is people who write nonfiction books that need to be put in the fucking fiction category. So I have an issue with that as well, but I don't think, I would guess none. And I would guess none because it was more unknown than known at that point. So they probably wouldn't have known whether or not, or estimated whether or not it would have benefited them.
Well, I can tell you they got a problem, and it's worse than just kids taking it. And there's a straight line between the issues here and the cultural problems, some of which are, yes, the loudspeaker and commodifying the brand that has gone all the way down from the top of the top, the elite of the elite, to 18 to 22-year-olds who are trying to make it. And my point is that they are very medically savvy at BUD/S, right? They really, the SEALs are, the center is. They really pay attention, literally measuring to make sure that kids live and can make it through these things. And the question,
the safety net for the students that they don't know is there is actually very robust.
Exactly. And so my point is they have the capacity to do exactly what you're saying, which is to screen them and measure them before it starts. And then each step of the way, right? That's how you begin your research. That's how you, and what I'm saying is we're in 2022.
Yeah.
And that's not happened after 20 years of war. That's the problem. Not.
They may not want to know what happens.
Well, I think
that would actually be my suspicion.
And I think that's something. I mean, again, I'm not here to say I have the answers. I don't have the answers.
Yeah.
I'm a journalist. I ask the questions and see what the response is, and then try to figure that out from there. But that's part of the problem, right? Is that they don't measure this stuff, and no one has said, "Hey, this is something we have to do," because even if it does nothing for the next 20 years, 50 years down the road, there's going to be another scenario where we're going to send guys out, and if we don't have this information, we're going to make the same mistakes again. And from as a journalist, all I'm trying to do with a book like this, or any kind of journalistic product that I put out, is to say to the public, this is what we have to look at. You can choose not to look at it, you can disagree with it, you can choose to ignore it, but the public, there has to be a record. There has to be some record, the best possible effort to make a accurate and undistorted record of things that occurred, and on something that, selfishly I think is interesting and important, right? Other people may disagree, but to me it's sort of like, if the U.S. taxpayer did not write a blank check to the successive administrations for foreign wars, we would not have had anywhere near as many of these problems and situations that are discussed in the book. And so in other words, I don't find fault in the big sense with operators at all. One of the things that I take a lot and get a lot of criticism about is, you hate SEALs. You're a SEAL hater. And
I wouldn't say that your book came across as if you hate SEALs. If I'm being totally honest with you, I would say that it seems that you might have an axe to grind with them.
And that's, I appreciate that perspective. From my perspective, the issue is let's use a generic example. You write a book about your heroics and your time in the service, right?
Of which there was none, for clarity. Trust me, truly there was not.
And the story is, as you describe it, much more of fiction than nonfiction, right? But sold as nonfiction. That is you have put into the public domain and the public record a version of something that is for public consumption. And so it is open to understanding, is it accurate? What happened? And I don't just mean as a fact checker. I mean fact checking, but there's a bigger story there. The more I dug, the more there was a common thread. There was an arc of problematic behavior that is not reflective of every SEAL or even the majority of SEALs, but it is reflective of the problems in the SEAL community. And if SEAL Team 6 was not the world's most famous military brand or unit, or if the Navy SEALs didn't have a TV show and endless movies and endless books, you would appropriately place that and sort of say in its context, which is, okay, there's a small group of guys who like to talk about themselves and, tell war stories that are, somewhat true, not worthy of doing investigative journalism. This is not that. And so from my perspective, the public is due and deserves a honest account. What I feel is the good, the bad, and the ugly, sort of three dimensions. So, one thing I tried to, I took great effort in writing this book was to make sure that the tone was not strident, that I'm not screaming about how, every person, these are like, at the end of the day, there's just people, all right? It's just guys, and most of them are good, but we do have to accept the idea that good men can do bad things and bad men can do good things. And sometimes it can be very confusing and hard to sift through who's who in that. And, I think that trying to get at that complexity and nuance in this setting was interesting and important. And it's meant to be, somewhat of a corrective, a counter narrative to what the popular myth and culture is. And I think, unfortunately, that there are going to be more problems coming. And I don't know if it's going to be in 1 year. I don't know if it's going to be in 10 years. Something is going to happen logically, I think. And you will see the seeds of sort of the strain of the virus that's discussed and in here. And it's not because I have an axe to grind against the SEALs. It's because the time that I've spent reporting, I was really, I want to say moved by the SEALs that I was interviewing with the anguish that they felt and experienced inside the teams at the highest level, not at the E4, but at the E9, at the 06, 07, and above level, at how much I just want to choose my words carefully here because it's important. Their anguish at how ineffectual they were in trying to fix what they saw were catastrophic problems from the inside and failing over and over again, and what that meant for the men that they led, whether they were NCOs or whether they were officers. And I have to say I was really touched and moved by the emotional weight that those guys carried for their failures. And so I felt a little bit like, what I'm doing here is carrying their weight a little bit for them to say, look, I think if I could write about my sources and even without naming them, but just describe who they were and what their experiences were, I think the story would be a lot more significant, because when you see the human side of it, it's really moving and I think it's galvanizing too. But unfortunately, this is not a space in journalism where you can name names, and so it's hard, and that's the challenge that I have. And it's a balance, and it's never perfect, but it's what I've seen those men go through, SEALs, who I respect, whom I admire, who I think I have a 12-year-old son who I describe this to him and I say, these are men who I would want you to experience and meet in your lifetime, to have the exposure to understand on a human level a certain amount of greatness. And I don't mean that in the big, tall way. I mean that in look, these are people who can be selfless and who, just like firemen or cops are the ones who run into the burning building, and that's different than most people. That's a fact, and we need to appreciate that where it's appropriate. And that there are when I hear the sort of axe to grind thing, I appreciate.
Oh, it doesn't
your
bother
perspective.
me.
No. I'm saying that I want your listeners to understand that I've spent years thinking about this issue and what the sort of confronting what is the purpose of making some of this public. Mm-hmm. There's a difference in here. I will note that, for instance, if we went into the squadrons, I don't even think I mentioned Black Squadron in this book because the purpose.
Peripherally.
Okay, peripherally. What I don't do is don't go into all of the things that I know about what they do that's on the classified side.
Yep.
Not because I don't think that there weren't problems or because that there wasn't, that it isn't interesting or all that, but because the point was not to expose for exposure's sake. The point was to show where there are these patterns that find themselves continually over time and in different places, and follow that pattern, and try to make, more than anything, the Navy and the Pentagon face it and say, you guys did this. You need to solve this problem. One of the things that's not in here, and I don't know if you know this, but at least three different times, Pentagon has considered shutting down SEAL Team 6.
I did not know that. In recent eras?
The most recent one that I know of is 2009, 2010. And one of the ideas that was floated at the Pentagon for doing it was actually to quietly flood SEAL Team 6 with Marines. And the reason, as I understood it, there were sort of two parts. One is that the Marines, first of all, the Marines are inside the Navy, so that makes it a lot easier.
They don't like that fact.
I know.
I just tell them they're the men's department, and they seem to feel better about that.
Okay, and then now this is the part that's going to upset some people, is that one of the ideas was that the Marines at the boot camp level are given a certain ethical framework that they stick to throughout their careers, which is not to say that they don't have their own problems. It's not to say that, the rest of the military doesn't have all sorts of issues with corruption, big and small. It totally does. But I thought that was fascinating, that internally it was like the Marines, if the Marines do one thing that we want them to do that SEAL Team 6 is not doing right now, it's be ethical, have an ethical component. And so the idea was you'd attach some Marines to each squadron, like a troop. I don't remember how the numbers worked out, but there was like a whole worked out plan where you attached a troop of Marines. They'd have to pass Green Team. They weren't given a free ride, but you would slowly flood them into Dam Neck until it was no longer SEALs. And, I think that to me is a very telling and interesting idea. Obviously they didn't do it. And
it's also based off a false premise. That because you have or are taught ethics or morals in boot camp, that's going to actually govern your behavior.
Yes, but I think that all they were responding to was we have this cultural problem that's affecting things on the battlefield. We have a problem we see coming up that could be very bad. How do we fix it? It's not that that would have been the right idea. I'm not suggesting that it was. It's just interesting to me to see what they were debating and what the conversation was at the 4-star and above level about how to solve this problem that they had, solve the problem in time. I mean, today it may not be the same at all. It could be very different.
Yeah.
I think also it's, in the parochial world of the military, it's funny to, threaten the SEALs with the idea that, the Pentagon wanted to replace them with Marines, which
I've had some phenomenal experience with Marines. They are, and that's the thing. I think a lot of people think that there's inter-service rivalries, of course, which there are, and I think they were much more serious pre-9/11. But, on the battlefield, anytime I would look over and I would see a Marine, usually they were used in blocking positions. It's like, fuck yeah, things are going to be okay. Because a Marine will stay on a corner until the corner doesn't exist, and somehow the Marine is still there. But again, though, like you said, and I think you said it well, that there are problems in all branches of the military.
Absolutely.
And I think those problems, well, they were there before 9/11. I can tell you that much for sure. Mostly they were alcohol driven at that point. But again, exposed durations to combat, which all four services are feeling the brunt of. It takes things from being a straight line to being very surreptitious, and there's a lot of errors made turning left and right along the way. I definitely don't think that there are any military units or branches that have gotten a free pass from that exposure. I think there's probably very severe problems in all four of those branches, which is not to take away from anything that you might have written about in the book.
No, absolutely. I think that these are bigger issues that Americans refuse to confront. I mean, this goes to the issue of who serves and who spends their time thinking about it and dealing with the consequences. And to me, the issue is the people that we elect to Congress and to public office are not held to account for the decisions they make to let these things to push these events into position to happen, and then once they're going, their lack of accountability. They don't hold anyone else to account, and so it becomes this blank check. To me, it's like madness that we did 20 years of military time and
20 plus. The war has not ended.
But
People are just different places.
I know, but I mean in Afghanistan, for instance. I use Afghanistan because it was just folly. And that wasn't something that wasn't knowable at the beginning. I'm not saying that it was wrong to start in Afghanistan or that the response to 9/11 was incorrect or the wrong one. I'm not saying that at all. But how do you come up with 20 years?
I don't know. And it's crazy. Most of the people who were in office that you may have written a check for to make the decisions at that time, they're out of office. And the people who were starting their military career are now finishing it. So those that you empowered to make the decisions are fucking gone. And then here we still are later with the people who are still doing the things you decided on 20 years ago.
Right. That's the people who bear the brunt of the consequences it's the wrong end. It's the wrong end.
Yeah.
It's a very unjust scenario and situation where we do not punish the politicians who need to be punished. Now, by punished, I don't mean go to jail. I mean,
I do.
Well, I mean, there's for some of them, yes, but I've always.
I mean, it should fit the crime, obviously, but
I think that it's sort of like I covered the CIA for 10 years or so, and very closely, and especially the rendition and torture elements of the post 9/11 agency world, and one of the things that I sort of came to was, look, if you're going to, we need to expose the stuff that was wrong and needed to be, journalistically, obviously. But I never thought that someone who was a GS-13 who went too far in an interrogation cell should go to prison before the president of the United States or a, senior official in the Bush and or Obama administration who authorized and made the decision, who clearly made it very clear what they wanted from the CIA, and then when it, knowing that it was bad and, the headwinds changed publicly, pretended as though they were completely misled by the CIA, some of which was true, but none of it changed the fact that they wanted torturous interrogations because they thought that's what would get them intelligence. So, you sort of have to put this in scope and scale. And, do I think that what the GS-13 did was appropriate or moral or just? No, and I'm going to write about it and report on it as best I can. But they sure as hell don't need to be going to, suffering legal consequences in a just world before an elected official.
Well, in a just world, they both would. Well, not they both. Everybody would suffer the consequences of their actions. They would be held accountable.
Right.
In my mind, the people who step outside of the box with which they have empowerment to operate and they land on the outside of that, I think they do have to be held accountable. And I'm talking the GS-13 or the the individual that's on the ground. I don't know the system in place to hold those. And this is also why I think things can get the way that they are. There is no real breadcrumb to the person at the top, right? Like, where is the exact direct link that we can hold this person accountable for?
Well, that's built in. I mean, not to be too cynical,
they both. I agree with you that it is built in. They both should be held accountable.
Look, the SEAL Team 6 in a lot of ways is SEAL Team 6, Delta, the CIA are, although in scale are different, they're the same tool for president. They are a scalpel that gives them a built-in deniability and an ability to say when things go bad. CIA more so than the DoD components, but on a continuum, I would say they're pretty close. They're actually insulated. They're meant to be to help insulate the president from the decisions that they make that cost people's lives, that go badly. By design, it's that way. Yeah, by design, it's that way. We didn't know. We got bad intelligence. If only they were competent, or if they had listened to what we had asked them to do, then this wouldn't have happened, right? No, you're the president. You authorized it. And in every which way except for writing on paper, you said, I want, in no uncertain terms, this is what I want. The GS-13, the E-8, does not get on the battlefield and not know what is wanted and expected of them. It just doesn't happen. It's a
at a tactical level for sure. You may not understand the operational planning of the battle space that you're in, but at a tactical level, like an E-8 is going to be a tactical expert, not like an operational expert.
Yeah, but that's my point is that there's no confusion about what the head shed wants, right? There's no and above them and above them and above them, and some of it is written down and some of it isn't. But that's they're expendable tools. Is my point, is that when things go bad, we can say it wasn't us, it wasn't me. I'm the White House, we're the White House, and we didn't know about this. Okay, no one said you knew about it. You authorized a series of events and communicated in all but written terms, in some cases also in written terms, that these are the things that you wanted done, or these are the and asked to basically don't tell me about it and choose to avoid your responsibility for being held accountable. You wanted to make the decisions, but you didn't want to, you don't want to be held accountable when they go bad.
Let me know if it goes good, and if it goes bad, you need the office 4 doors down.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so the books, the authors that you're talking about in the TV show and the movies, do you feel that those individuals that are involved in that speak for the SEAL brand? Because that's one question I had for you. I try to figure out, I ask myself, what is the SEAL brand and who actually speaks for it?
Well, I think, first of all, it's an excellent question.
Because people will ask me my opinion on things that are SEAL related, and I will answer them. I can answer via the lens of my experience. I cannot speak for the organization because I don't speak for the community. The authors that have, and like I'm friends with Jack Carr, who writes he writes fiction-esque based off a lot of his own experience. And I know some of the other authors who I have severe criticisms of the authenticity of their work. But I look at their work, and I was thinking about this because I knew we were going to talk. It's like, do they speak for the SEAL community? And I land on no, they don't speak for the SEAL community. And the SEAL Team TV show is what it is, right? It's they're selling fucking soap in between advertising breaks, so I don't think they can speak for it. And I actually don't even know who speaks for the SEAL brand. I was curious as to your opinion, because you kind of use that as a broad overarching term in the book, and I'm curious as to, in your eyes, who actually has the voice that people should listen to, speaking for the SEAL brand itself.
Well, let me adjust the premise just slightly,
Sure.
which is I don't think anyone should be speaking for the SEAL brand, because I don't think the SEAL should be a brand.
Correct.
That we're talking about. Now, your question, which is excellent, is do I think Marcus Luttrell or Rob O'Neill or Matt Bissonnette speak for the SEALs or SEAL Team 6? Of course they don't. They speak for themselves.
Yeah.
First and foremost and almost exclusively. That's not the question. The question is, what does the military and the Navy, which, by the way, relies on the SEALs for its single largest recruitment tool that it has and has for
A very long time.
a very long time.
Yeah.
And so the question is what is the responsibility of the Navy, of the Pentagon, of naval special warfare to say to someone, and I don't want to hear the story. I don't want to hear, well, they're out and we can't affect what they do and say. And while that's true in some level, on another level, it's complete bullshit. To say, look, you can write your story if you want, but don't go out and tell lies, right?
Yeah.
And if we choose to say nothing, we are either by omission, we are supporting and condoning your version of events, or we are outright appreciative of the fact that your story keeps us from having to talk about all of the truly disastrous and fatal errors that were made at officer and leadership levels that led to the thing that you are writing about. And to me, that's the issue. The issue is not whether, a E5 who ends up, or an E6 who ends up in a bad situation and tells the story of how they survived. Who could be against that? That's not that's not something you could be to get worked up about, right? The question is how does it fit in the bigger context? And in that context, the Navy SEALs and the SEAL officers in particular have helped create and stoke this idea of a brand that is, and guys want to make money off of it, right? I don't get out of the military. I don't begrudge someone who wants to advertise that they were a SEAL, and because they were a SEAL, they can talk about XYZ and it makes them an expert in something. What do I care? That's every man and woman's right. The issue of SEAL brand and who speaks for it and what voice is first and foremost, is what they're selling true, right? I mean, is what they're selling true, and is there a responsibility from the military's perspective? And I say about the military, I really mean NSW, the Navy in particular, right? It's their little fiefdom to say
It would have to be NSW because the bigger Navy doesn't have the insight. I think I know where you're going with this. I don't know if I'm curious as to the mechanism of how what I think you're going to say would happen.
But the thing is that it's already clear that they want it, right? They want the SEAL brand out there as a recruiting tool. So ultimately, their silence speaks volumes, right?
What would you want them to do? Like a statement from NSW?
In some
spitballing
cases,
in real time, like
sure.
Yeah.
In some cases, it's a statement. In some cases, it is. I mean, I'm not going to use names here, but I'm going to give an example. Okay, there was a former member of your unit who had done something very heroic and successful, and was also in a very bad mental and emotional and psychological state at that point in their career, and they got out for medical reasons, and there was a quick effort by Hollywood to see if they could turn this mission into a movie. And one of the things is some of the senior leaders at the command, this was post bin Laden and post O'Neill and Bissonnette, very quietly but very firmly went to the producers in Hollywood and said, leave this guy alone. You're opening a door that is horrible for him. It's going to have huge negative effects for him personally. And you don't know what you don't know. So let sleeping dogs lie. And for the last 10 years, that worked. It worked. It basically scared Hollywood off of this particular person and story, not because there wasn't anything untrue necessarily or that it wasn't worthy of doing a story, but because people who cared recognized that what comes with this, there's a huge baggage that comes with this. And to be honest with you, I think that's that's really adult. That's a real, as a parent, that's how I'd want it to be handled. And I think that's part of the way it needs to be done. What happened with Chris Kyle, that's what didn't happen with Chris Kyle, right? There were red flags. NSW knew the red flags in the book and in his career and problems And they look the other way because everyone benefited. And so do I blame Chris Kyle? No, I don't blame Chris Kyle.
I don't think everybody benefited in the long run.
Well, that's
So Chris Kyle I met one time for 2 minutes at the parking lot of SEAL Team 3. Like I said, I'll always tell you when I'm making a hypothesis. So that's and I think I said hello. That was about it. I don't know. Most of the SEAL stories to me are not fascinating, by the way. I'm just like, oh yeah.
Well, you're a SEAL.
I'm like, cool fucking story. Yeah, like, move on and do your job. So what I did here are when things hit the wave tops. Like the military is going to what was the term that they used? The military is going to issue a statement on the accuracy of the words that you put into your book. That is a long-term, very negative consequence to Chris in that situation associated with it. So there was a short-term benefit, I guess, of being able to say, hey, this is who, and I don't know how that shit got into the book. I didn't read the book, but I did hear that happened. It was either an intentional or an accidental inflation of his awards. I don't think it's possible to have an accidental inflation of your awards.
That's right. And I can tell you how it happened.
Well, and point being, that always comes out. So it's not actually a benefit to Chris or the Navy, because in the end, the story will be told. It probably won't make the splash that it did when the book first came out. But if you are found out to have been lying about what happened in your career, that doesn't paint the SEAL community in a good light.
No, I mean, I think, going back to the question of do I think that these guys speak for the SEAL community, the answer actually is no. I think the perverse thing about all of this is that I'm going to say this. I try to say this like empathetically and a little compassionately, but without being, and I don't want to be glib, but in a lot of ways, it's like the worst are the loudest, right? In the sense that so what the public gets is the least realistic, the least authentic.
That's not actually uncommon, though. Look at the coverage of law enforcement as an example. You never see news stories leading with a cop helping somebody cross the street with the garbage bag. Or just think of another example, them just living up to every essence of what you would want a first responder to be. But you will see a shooting, and you'll see shooting after shooting after shooting, absent a lot of context and absent a soundbite. It oftentimes seems that the worst are the loudest, or it is at least reported in that way.
Yeah, but the difference, though, is what we're talking is not about a third party reporting anything. We're talking about the individuals themselves promoting their own story, selling their own story, saying,
and they have to be held accountable for that.
So all I'm saying is that I recognize that there's an inverse relationship between those who have books out about look at me and look what I did. At the same time, it's not about me. It's not about me. It's all about the team. It's all about the team.
The first chapter is almost always about how it's not about me.
It's, look, irony is dead. Irony is dead. All right, and
chapter 1. This book is not about me. You motherfucker. The other 10 chapters are all about you.
No, this book is all about everyone else that got me here, but who will not share in any of the checks that I'm about to cash. Which isn't to say I know there are guys who give to charity, and I'm not suggesting that there isn't good that is done with some of the money. And listen, we're in America. I don't begrudge anyone at all. I don't. I just think if you're going to tell a story, it should be true. And if, I'll tell you, I can't believe I'm going to say this on a podcast, but it's a little bit of an insight. I really wanted Matt Bissonnette to talk to me. I really wanted to talk to him.
How come?
I thought that he understands better than most, how corrupt the system, how rigged the system was at SEAL Team 6 and in naval special warfare for the officers. And what I knew from both people who had spoken to him about it and what he has written about explicitly, his perspective, and he writes about this, which is why should McRaven get another star or Obama run for, get reelected based on the work that I did and take all this glory and we're supposed to be silent. And there is a logic to that, which I appreciate, which is absolutely. I mean, and I talk about that in the book. The Obama administration was, Biden's line when he was vice president was Osama bin Laden is dead, and GM is alive, and Osama bin Laden is dead. That was his summary.
Great bumper sticker.
That was his summation of re-election for 2012, right? It was that. But there's something really interesting about that. He really distilled it down to like the two wins that the Obama administration, he was arguing, should give them a second term, and it worked. By the way, it worked. That's a pretty good. It's not a good bumper sticker, but it's effective actually. And so, is it for the E8 or E7 who was on that mission? Does it make sense or seem like the right thing to do or an okay thing to do to tell his version of events and do well for himself and take care of himself? Again, I'm not going to begrudge that decision. I think it is the person who decides to do that, and I think in the book I talk a lot about Bissonnet's career and what he did as he was getting out, just before he got out, and then what he did after he got out. And he's very effective at, he's very clever, very smart guy. And I wanted him. I mean, that's, by the way, when I go trolling for sources, the ones that I want are the ones that, if you want the dark side of things, you got to talk to the people who have done them and who know them and understand the nuances between something that is outright illegal and right on the edge, but may not be prosecutable, right? And understanding that it may be legal, but it's certainly not ethical or moral or whatever. And I think as a unit, right, militarily, tactically, that's what SEAL Team 6 is this fine, sharp edge of figuring out how to solve the problem within the bounds of what the U.S. government says is lawful, right? Here are your set of parameters. Here's what you can do. Here's what you can't do. Figure it out, right? And in that way, SEAL Team 6 is incredible, right?
I would say that actually describes all of special operations. It's basically nonlinear problem solving. There's
right.
levels to that, as there's levels to everything, but I mean, that's kind of it. You plan to the best of your ability. You go, and then you realize your plan sucked, or you were basing it off of information that wasn't correct, and you figure shit out on the ground.
Right. But what's different, or I think the way to extrapolate that is to say that cleverness, the learning how to ride that edge for your advantage, for success, for mission success, for achieving the goal and the objective, is how we see this culture within the teams of doing that. It has nothing to do with the battlefield, has nothing to do with operations. It has everything to do with their own personal, how they conduct themselves personally, how they take advantage for themselves.
It ties into, I think, a lot of them being wildly entrepreneurial when they get out as well, because it's creativity is rewarded. I think one of the biggest misconceptions, maybe this has gone away over time, is that you watch movies, and actually, this is probably true of a generation past, but you would watch movies and it's the people joining the military. Well, Your Honor, talking to it's either prison or the Army. Which one's it going to be? I'm like, I guess I'm going to the Army. So it's all these people where it's a last choice, or they think it's all Marine Corps boot camp where it's yes sir, no sir, and there's an aspect of that as well. But in my experience when I was in the military, it was people who were making their first choice.
Right.
And it's what they had wanted to do for a long period of time. You refine that further, you end up at BUD/S. And creativity at BUD/S is rewarded as well. So it is selected for, and I would say refined throughout a career. I mean, it doesn't shock me at all to see people who, when they get out, become so entrepreneurial because they'll encounter adversity and then they'll figure a way around it, or fail and just start over again.
Right, but there's a danger in it too, which is if you ain't cheating, you ain't trying, right? That's another important component of the culture of figuring out, and I think it must have been on one of your episodes we were talking about the experience in BUD/S, where you're told on day one of a evolution, this is your best time, and the next day you're going to be told you have to beat it by half, right? If you don't beat it by half, you got to go back and do it again. So someone figures out that if they go slow on the first round, and then you get rewarded by being, you tanked it the first time out, so that the second time you could beat it by half, and you're rewarded by being able to not have to spend the weekend in your quarters, right? That's how I remember the story going, and that's really clever, right? That's you're teaching something there that is not bad, but it has the potential to be, which is it's the cheating part, right? We're grading on a curve, and if you tank this in this way, what lesson am I learning? The lesson is if I game things right, if I engineer a solution that achieves what I'm told I'm asked to achieve, then I win. And that works in one way, but it is a double-edged sword, because there's a whole other world of human conduct, of military conduct that has nothing to do with what you did on the battlefield. And that, to me, I think is part of what I would say is, and that's true, by the way, in all special operations.
It's true in the business world. It's true probably in anywhere where there's a competitive atmosphere.
Absolutely. And actually, what I tell people about Code Over Country is that in a lot of ways, this is a case study in failed leadership more than anything else. I was very intentional in not naming names of guys who were under the rank of E8, for instance, because the point is that it is about the officers and the NCOs who are in charge and responsible. It's their job, right? In particular, the officers. Mm-hmm. And they need to be, I think, where appropriate, named and shamed. And
why did you use the real names as opposed to putting down their rank and the position that they held? What was the benefit of putting a true name out there for people who were, I'm not mentioned in the book because, again, I haven't done shit in my career. And I was actually gone from the command by the time the vast majority of the things that you wrote about happened. I was there from 2002 to 2006. So, and for people who don't know, the kinetic nature of both Afghanistan and Iraq ramped up. I'd say 7, 8, 9 were probably the peak of it. So a lot of the stuff that you wrote about, it was past my time. But I personally, speaking for myself, would be mortified to see my name in a book, especially if I had joined the military to serve my country and had not had the desire. I almost look at it, and I don't mean this negatively, but I almost look at it as a sense of doxing somebody. And I'm curious why you made the choice to include true names. Did you talk to everybody whose name that you included in there?
At some point, I had tried to.
Okay,
there's no, you make an effort to reach out for comment to any person that you report about, named and in some cases even unnamed. It's a fair question. It's one that I think certainly a lot of people who've served in the government feel strongly about, and I understand. I think for any officer who, first of all, number one, no one's name is classified at SEAL Team 6. There are elements, as you know, about SEAL Team 6 and SWDG that it would
be their choice to reveal their involvement there, not necessarily having it outside of their control.
Well, that's not actually the case. In fact, you can find, if you know where to look, on unclassified lists, the identity of enlisted and officer personnel who are attached to SEAL Team 6.
No shit.
Yes, I have.
Good job, U.S. government.
Here's as I understand it. Here's actually something that's really interesting, and I'm not gonna avoid the question that you asked. I'm gonna get to it, but one of the differences between, and this is just a bureaucratic technical difference that I don't pretend to know why it happened this way, but this is how it was explained to me by someone from SEAL Team 6. Delta doesn't exist, right? The Army does not acknowledge the unit in any way. It is classified. Every part of it is classified. And one's association with that unit is also classified. So there are no lists of unclassified information that in any way indicates that someone's attached to that unit. And that's why, in fact, it's just called the unit, right? Because it didn't have a name. And that has to do with how the Army established Delta. Mm-hmm. The Navy, and this is the part I don't know what the bureaucratic thing is. The Navy apparently does not have the same system. And so that any command, no command in the Navy is classified. The elements of what it does is classified,
But not the personnel?
not the personnel.
Wow.
And there are, and so I can literally pull up for you from my computer right now a list of every member of SEAL Team 6 that was on a unclassified Navy website, of everyone alphabetically from the unit that served in Iraq or Afghanistan. Who I think the particular thing was like the joint. It was like a unit
they tied
citation.
it to a goddamn award?
Yes, it was unit citations. Okay, but it is everyone's name and the deployments that they were on, the particular deployments.
Yeah.
And it is explicitly described as, you know, the I'm going to blank now on the newer version of what development group is, but it's
TAC Devron?
yeah, TAC Devron, exactly. TAC Devron Squadron 1, TAC Devron Squadron 2, right?
Yep.
TAC Devron Squadron 3, right? And if you are a E8 and you get promoted to an E9, or you are, as part of your promotion lists in the unclassed Navy system, are assigned to a unit for, you know, this next 2 years or whatever, that used to be all unclassified and published by the Navy. It was the goat locker. And so actually as a reporter, that was where I went to figure out, you know, someone would tell me, you know, you really need to look into this, or you need to look into this person. And, you know, you go in and Google. I'm not like this isn't magic. You Google and you find things that it's amazing to see what was unclassified. To answer your question specifically, I believe that the only way first of all, from the standpoint of telling a story, and I don't mean story, but reporting something of this substance and gravity, that stylistically, pseudonyms and you know, nicknames or initials doesn't work. But more importantly, if what you hope is that journalism will have some positive effect of change, fixing something that went wrong, or urging someone to hold themselves accountable, or even just lessons learned, that unless people who are responsible are named, it just doesn't work. That is in my opinion, a bedrock principle of investigative journalism in this sphere. There have been plenty of times when I have reported on things about the CIA, personnel, people, and individuals whose identities are classified, in which you bow towards, and sometimes you have to sometimes it's not an easy call. Sometimes, you know, you err on the side of making it public, making it better for the public. And yes, I can understand and empathize that although obviously I can't imagine it personally because I've never been in that situation, but I can understand why that would really suck for the person who's named. But I don't think, you know, if you went through this book, you might find that there are people whose names are in the book, but who are not publicly identified with certain missions that they did, because that has not yet been made public. And their involvement in such a thing is not an issue of controversy, right? I don't think I named anyone for the point of naming them. I named people because it was relevant to what I was reporting on, which was misconduct, malfeasance, you know, cover-ups, potential crimes. And I don't think that if you were involved, let's say, in helping cover up a beheading in Afghanistan as an 06 or an 05, that somehow you get to skate and not have your name published because you were attached to SEAL Team 6. You know, there's no law about it, number one. And I don't think that serves the public good of trying to make sure something like that doesn't happen again. So, you know, it's not easy. I don't do it, I mean this sincerely. I don't do it willy-nilly. It's a serious issue. I think I've had the experience of being reported on and written about before, and it's an uncomfortable feeling, and it informs everything that I do as a reporter too, to remember that these are human beings who have families and have friends. And believe me, in the past, when I've written about some of these people dear to them let me know how upset they were that they had been named, and that's their right. And they, I would never reject someone, complaining to me or giving me their time and business for having done it. It doesn't mean I'm going to change. Mm-hmm. But
it wasn't an accusatory question.
No,
I was
not
curious.
at all. I didn't take it. No. I'm just so we're clear. I'm really trying. You asked an excellent question, and I'm thinking through all the people who are not from former members of SEAL Team 6, who are your listeners, who may not understand what decision making goes into, an investigative reporter's decision about who to name and who not to name, or what to disclose and what not to disclose, because there is no. There's no manual for it.
Yeah,
it's a case by case by basis, and you try to weigh. The question is public good versus just I think a lot of reporters, and I'm sure that I've been guilty of this at times when I was younger, they publish things or report things as a way of essentially saying, look at me, what I could get, look what secret I could dig up. And I worked, readers may not agree that I did a good job, but I worked really hard not to do that in this book. This wasn't about everything that was a national secret. This was about things that had gone wrong and need to be addressed and highlighted, and as best I can, tell a story that explains it all.
Yeah. For me as the reader, but again, I come from a different lens looking at the book. It doesn't make it more impactful or less to know the name. And yeah, that's why I asked that. I was curious about the decision-making process. I think there's some potential negative consequence for naming people that would have otherwise not been named. I don't necessarily know if it's going to help drive change, to be honest. Yeah.
It may not. I may fail. I may fail. That's something that I have to accept at the outset before it's even published, is that everything that I hope could happen, everything that I hope would happen as positive change or accountability. I'm not naive. I think it's a uphill battle. At the end of the day, you publish journalism for, as I said, bearing witness in a certain sense and leaving a record of what occurred. And I happen to be, I think that more broadly, the U.S. government in the national security space lies extensively, mostly by omission, but
same goddamn end state.
Exactly, and
same fucking end state.
And so the
I had these arguments with my kids. Like,
how so?
They'll be like, I'll ask him, so what'd you do this weekend? Oh, I was this. I'm like, oh, did you do this too? Oh, yeah. Like, just because you didn't tell me doesn't mean that it didn't.
Right. But except that we're talking about really grave issues, right? And
for sure, the gravest.
And the gravest, exactly. And what I believe is that my job as a reporter is to find the space where the government, and that's a broad term that I use, is omitting or lying about things that are of great national importance, right? This is all conduct that we're talking about here in this book is conduct in which is done with an American flag on the shoulder or somewhere, right, in the U.S. name and government's name and the people's name and our taxpayer dollars. And so it is by nature of public interest and of public import. Now, the public may not care. They may want to, make sure that, they only give a shit about making sure that every Sunday they get their, the football game is on, that they get the right, their team wins and that the cable works and that's, that's their business and I understand that. But that's not my job. My job is to, dig into what I think are injustices and things that are of public import that need to be exposed, not to be punitive. It's not meant to be punitive. It can be hard to understand that, I think, for a lot of people, but it's not meant to be punitive. It is really meant to say, look, 50 years from now, the U.S. government might find itself in a situation where it thinks that it needs to go fight for a infinite amount of time and send a really small group of men and maybe then women into this meat grinder. Here's a book about what happens when you don't think about the consequences of those actions. Here's something that tells you what goes on when the public sort of looks away and says, we're not going to hold anyone in Congress or an administration accountable for letting these wars go on with no end in sight, right? And that's the best I can do. That's honestly and modestly, I mean that really modestly, is my aim and intention.
When you were on the Team House podcast, they asked you why did you decide to write this book? And I'll paraphrase, but correct me if I'm wrong. You said something along the lines of you feel that the good books have already been written, or the books that tell the good stories have already all been written?
Yeah, I think that I guess, well, I don't remember exactly how I said it. And
Nor do I, unfortunately.
Well, no. And I hope I wasn't being glib. What I meant is that the public already has the unambiguously heroic version of the SEAL brand. And
where do they get that from? I mean, you're talking about the TV shows. My question, I guess my question to you would be, where would you point people for the good stories about the SEAL community?
Oh, good is very subjective. What I mean is the heroic stories, right? If we Americans, right? Let me ask you a question. Sure. What's the most popular war movie in American film history?
Oh, shit. In American film history?
Yes. As of today.
American film history. I mean, I would probably guess something like Saving Private Ryan.
Wrong. Although not a bad answer. It's American Sniper.
Is it really?
Yes, it is.
That is
a
dog shit movie.
Opinions aside about the quality of I'm not a film critic. I'm just okay.
I'm not either, but that was a dog shit movie.
It is the most successful, made the most money in American film history for a movie about war. And the reason why I ask it and the reason why I bring it up is because it is the way Americans, get a lot of their information and ideas about the military. And there is obviously, I think clearly, a need in our country and probably in most countries and cultures to have a hero, to have heroes, and to champion the hero myth. But a lot of it is a myth. And what I was saying about the other books, the other SEAL books, I was referring to the books that have been written by SEALs about their service. And in those books, they are and books that are essentially hagiographies about SEALs, SEAL operations, and units. And in those, you get the highlights of a good thing, right? We know what happened with the Maersk, Alabama, right? And the result from the American perspective was a good one, right? The hostage was saved. Mm-hmm. And no one's debating that.
That's only the wave top, though.
Exactly. But that's exactly it. And so what I was trying to do is to tell the story in a more three-dimensional way, which is, as I said before, the good, the bad, and the ugly. They're all there. This is human. Ultimately, you talk about, I'm fascinated with war crimes and what happens with when people go into war and conduct violence up close and personal for long periods of time. And let's posit by saying that the U.S. military, period, regardless of unit, is, as time goes on, better and better and better at not committing atrocities, at at following the international rules of war, laws of war, and that the tragedy and of dropping a bomb from 20,000 feet in the air for one bad guy and killing 30 people because the number was allowable is its own version of a war crime, in a sense, right? That you took 29 people's lives who had nothing to do with anything, who did not deserve to die because you decided that it was appropriate, you being the U.S. government, not someone in uniform, to take this person's life, right? Those are real things that we have to grapple with as a society, and we need to think about, and that we are, by and large, better and better. That
The math, if you will, is better and better.
Yeah, and then the arc of U.S. behavior and conduct on the battlefield overall has improved, over time. That said, I still am fascinated with what I think is the darkest recesses of our national conduct, what we do. And I'm not saying that from the standpoint of I think it's all bad. This isn't a moral, right? Humans have been committing war crimes since the beginning of time, period. Not everyone, but it is something that happens in conflict. And one of the things that I thought a lot about during the height of the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan was that the story from both the press and the military itself, of course, absent of some scandals, Abu Ghraib being the biggest one and the most recent one at the time, was basically we're doing really well, we do everything right, and from human experience that can't possibly be true. And so that becomes my interest. I'm not saying that I did not turn and say I want to look into these things, this specific thing. It came to me from, I was doing something else about JSOC, and someone said, you really need to look at the hatchets. You really need to look at what the hell is going on with the hatchets and our guys on the battlefield with hatchets. And that opened my eyes. That was, but I'm interested in that space. And I think that if the public were more interested in that space, we would conduct ourselves better, and we would maybe be a little more restrained as a nation in terms of how we decide to send people off to fight wars that we want nothing to do with or having any involvement with, except for to watch on television. And so the material that comes back that the public eats up, I mean, I'm not blaming someone for writing a book that they know is going to be a bestseller. That's a hard thing to decide not to ignore. The public wants this.
I don't have a problem with it either, as long as they tell the truth. My theory on this is for people ask me to write a book. I'm like, what the fuck am I going to write about? But people are free to do with what they want to with their experiences. My only caveat to that is I want them to have a very strong tie and relationship to the truth. Because if you're lying to people to make money, I mean, you got to sleep with yourself at the end of the day, look yourself in the mirror. But I think that when the truth is deviated from, it absolutely undermines, to use the term, the brand of the SEAL. It hurts everything around the SEAL community. I'm still wrapping my head around the term brand. But it's good, though. I understand it, except for, a lot of brands have brand managers, and, there's guidelines on how you talk about them. It's like,
Except, to quote, look, and it's in the book, there are officers, one still in, one just out, Tim Szymanski and Admiral Wyman Howard, who have said to other officers, peers and colleagues who were wavering about whether they wanted to leave the military and maybe go public a little bit with how they were treated and the things that they saw, were advised to, quote, protect the brand. Protect the brand. There are actually men from NSW community who think and have thought long and hard about the power of the brand in terms of its political weight in Washington, within the military, within special operations community. I mean, some of it is totally understandable, right?
Yeah.
SEALs and SEAL Team 6 want to have a certain influence within JSOC, and you just extrapolate and go up. And it's presidents love SEALs. There is a now 20-year tradition of making sure that there are SEAL officers who serve in the White House as experts and advisors on counterterrorism, whatever is the issue of the day, and they love SEALs, and there's plenty to love. I'm not suggesting that somehow is.
Don't get me wrong. You're sitting across the table from somebody who might be more critical of the SEAL community than a lot. I don't think that senior officers talking that way is a good thing. So one thing, I'm sure you've heard this: long live the brotherhood.
Right.
There is an online on Facebook, which is also known as a SCIF, apparently, community. We'll leave the name, it's SEAL-based.
I know what it is.
Yeah, of course you do. And I am a part of the community, but I very infrequently, if ever, will actually post anything. And except for when, to go completely on a tangent that doesn't matter, there was an individual who was going very deep down the rabbit hole, the QAnon rabbit hole. And all I wrote was, hey, man, if you're looking for professional help, just ask for it. Left it.
Good for you.
Many of the other people in that group were like, hey, man, you're you got 1 foot over the fucking cliff. We need to rein it back. It was actually, I found it was like a huge cut and paste that a lot of the peripheral communities QAnon were posting. So, and I was actually, to be honest with you, I was really surprised, not that there was an overwhelming volume, but there were more guys than I thought who went deep down the rabbit hole with the conspiracy theories. And it rattled me a little bit because in my experience, critical thinking was rewarded. And I also know that, depending on where you are in your life circumstances, maybe it's easier to attach yourself to a conspiracy theory than look in the mirror and deal with what you have to deal with. So I don't put too much judgment onto it, but that community of people, one of the most common things is long live the brotherhood. In my mind, if you want it to actually live, it has to be based in its integrity. And if it's going to be based in its integrity, you have to tell the truth. And that doesn't mean you hide the things that are unsightly. From a leadership perspective, to be honest, a lot of the stuff you talk about in the book and the culture, my experience at the command on the East Coast was the opposite. It was the most fantastic leaders that I had ever been around in my military career. We fired people. There was no sweeping anything under the rug. People didn't meet the standard and they were shit canned. I was questioned on anything that might be a lack of integrity. But that's how, if you're going to build the foundation like that, it has to be built upon that. Otherwise, the brotherhood doesn't actually mean anything. And people talking things about like, well, hey, protect the brand. Again, people can choose the terms that they want to, but the number one way to actually protect the brand is to tell the fucking truth and be transparent. I don't disagree at all with a level of transparency into the military and military operations. I actually think it's essential. Obviously, you don't want to like, hey, this is how,
right,
when you get to the threshold of a door, this is what you do, man.
Right.
It's like, maybe we'll put that to the side. But there has to be that level of transparency because I do want it to be heavy on the American citizen's shoulder because
yes,
it's such a hard string to draw out, but the decisions that you make to put people into, it's all tied together to a degree, but it's largely invisible. I don't even remember where I was going with, other than it has to be, the foundation has to be in that integrity. And those officers who are saying things like, protect the brand, I respect you for who you are and what you've done, but I think you're wrong. In an attempt, if your brand isn't going to survive, if people tell the truth, you have a fucked up brand.
Well, I think, I was going to ask you a question, and it's something I ask every SEAL that I ever sit down and talk to, and anyone.
What type of hair products do I use? I'm not sharing those secrets. That's GS-14 classified.
You don't have enough hair to have hair.
Sometimes it's been gloriously long. I find less shampoo with less hair.
It's easier, right? Just
one drop, one and done.
What would you say is the difference culturally between SEAL Team 6 and Delta? And what I don't mean is what are the tactical differences. Let's accept for the second.
I would say they're defined by their similarities from a tactical perspective.
There is clearly a different DNA, right? There's a different culture. What would you describe as the difference between the two organizations?
So I actually deployed with them one time. I was part of I forget what they called it, interoperability exchange, whatever it may be, but the
Interrock.
Interrupt. Yeah. Damnick was focusing on Afghanistan. CAG was focusing on Iraq. Smarter people than I said, hey, maybe it's not a great idea if we're so geographically focused. So I didn't know what to expect. And I went down there and I deployed with A Squadron. And they would send a contingent up to work with us, and we would send a contingent down to work with them. And very rapidly became incredibly good friends with people who were at that command. For absolute clarity, I have nothing but respect for, and for whatever reason, people think it's like, oh, you were SEAL, you must hate all other special. It's like, no, these guys are fucking awesome. The CAG guys were some of the most technically proficient, professional, phenomenal leadership, and I'm still friends with some of them now. And I got shot in 2005 on a target with them in Iraq. So I didn't know what to expect, and what I found is that they were very similar, actually from, I hate the term operator, but from, or an assaulter. You know, those are very broadly used terms. I didn't find a lot of differences. One of the things that I did notice was different, and you could feel this a little bit with the squadrons, and maybe this has changed now, but a lot of the squadrons, and you talked a little bit about this when on the Team House, you can come from anywhere in the military to be, if you make it through selection. But there seemed to be a collection of Green Berets in one squadron, Rangers in one squadron, and quite frankly, I don't remember. Maybe it was a mix of both. So they had different personalities based off the background that they came from. The biggest difference, again, I found so many similarities as opposed to differences. They didn't think different on target. They shot as well or better than us. They were tacticians for sure. I think there was more of an emphasis, at least at that time. Well, and there weren't that many books being written at that time. I guess in talking to guys I knew then, later, there was more an emphasis on this is what we do and maybe let's just not talk about it. But at a tactical level.
You think that from your perspective, your experience is that culturally the difference is how public they were about what they did.
Or how public they were not.
Right. Okay.
Yeah.
I always ask that question because one of the things that I've seen in reporting on this issue of SEALs versus not SEALs, but is the question of how the dynamics of team versus the individual play out. And one of the things that I came across in my reporting early on was that in those early years, 04, 05 in particular, for CAG, they had some of the same problems that Team 6 would come to have because they were seeing the most action that any unit was seeing, period, in a generation. And the question I had was, why don't they have some of the same cultural problems that SEAL Team 6 and therefore the larger SEAL community NSW has? And I would ask that question all the time of, in particular, senior members of SEAL Team 6 who spent a lot of time, moving in and around the unit directly and indirectly.
Yep, the joint world.
And one of the things, and as well as members from Delta, and one of the things that I got back a lot was there was this belief that no one was above the unit, and whether that was the standard that you had to maintain to get there, not just getting in, but then maintain each day. And I don't, I know that I'm speaking broadly here. I'm not. They have lots of problems, plenty of problems, and the reason why I was interested in it was because there was a particular officer at the time who was basically was sent away after a second deployment in Iraq, and he was someone who clearly would have made flag, and he had everything going for him. He was highly viewed within the Army and within the JSOC world, and but he was overly aggressive in Iraq, and it wasn't the first time in his career that he had been sort of carelessly aggressive. And the way that I was told that Delta dealt with their problem children was this sort of the unofficial way, was they recognized the guys who had a virus that needed and when it was on the battlefield, there were things that they could live with and accept for the sake of, there was an acceptance overall of psychological warfare that no one wants to talk about publicly, but absolutely existed within a few small units. And they would accept it at that time. And then when things wound down a little bit, they also recognized how much of a cancer it would be if they promoted that person. And in this case, it was an officer, but there was also a discussion about some of the other guys who were enlisted. Mm-hmm. And so one of the things that I was told was like, what CAG did was they just gave them the pink slip. They just literally sent them out of the unit. They didn't give them a reason. There was no justification. There was no criminal referral. It wasn't to send anyone to a court-martial. They weren't going to publicly name and shame them. They sent a message, though, to everyone else in the unit that we don't do this, mm-hmm. or we did this and we're not doing it ever again, and this is the line that you cannot cross. And I was asking, what is the difference culturally that had them doing that versus what I was seeing at Dam Neck as a reporter that was not that? That was officers continually promoted up despite things in their background that absolutely disqualified them from serving. And the answer I got back, it's not scientific. I'm not. Mm-hmm. It's an open-ended question that I have no answer that has satisfied me. But the thing that I've heard is, well, we, CAG, believe that ultimately no one is above the unit, and that there is a certain standard that we require that it's the issue that you were bringing up about integrity, right? There's an integrity here that if we violate this line of integrity, it all goes to shit. Maybe not right away, but eventually. And that to me, and I don't think I may have failed at different parts in the book in trying to answer that question on Dam Neck side, but that to me is the cultural story, is like, what is it about? And I was thinking about it when you brought up the Long Live the Brotherhood, because one of the things that fascinates me is the idea that, when you are at Buds, you're in a boat, you got a boat crew, and you literally have to all row in the same direction, right? And you learn at the basic starting point that to succeed, you have to work together as a team. And so one of the things that I've heard is, well, SEALs view things from the standpoint of, as long as they can fix, if you don't carry your weight or you're a shitty performer, we're going to call you out. There's no secret in the circle, right? We're going to absolutely shame you in front of our group here that you're not pulling your weight, you're not performing. But I may not tell anyone else outside of this circle. I'm going to protect you from that embarrassment, and we're going to keep it in-house. Now, again, these are generalities. When I interviewed Marcinko, and he described the exact same psychological, cultural concept for how he was going to set up SEAL Team 6, you would have to be willfully ignorant to not draw the connection between, and there are other moments along the way that suggest that there's this something cultural there that it has to be guarded against. It doesn't have to be stomped out. It just has to be guarded against. And I get to play a little bit. I get to do the Q and you get to do the A. I'm just interested in what that difference is, because I find it really fascinating.
So a couple of things. And this is something I'll tell you that I think that the SEAL community doesn't do a great job of. And that is, well, I take that back. It's hit or miss, and that's kicking the can down the road. Because let me tell you what happens at a command like CAG, where you give people the pink slip and they're allowed to leave with no repercussions. And I say this based off of what I saw from people that I know were kicked out of Dam Neck. There's a gap in information from, let's just say, the joint world to the white world, the white soft world. And if somebody leaves one of those commands and the next place that they land isn't informed of why, if there is no punishment for whatever may suit the crime, to speak broadly, at that command, that individual becomes the sole controller of that narrative.
Yep.
And very often what ends up happening is they can craft a narrative that is much like some of the books we're talking about, which what I mean by that is when you shake it, bullshit falls out. And they continue to climb the rank tree. And the next thing you know, if it's an enlisted guy, it's a 9 somewhere sitting in a desk who's making policy. So CAG didn't actually solve any problems, and I'm not making a judgment on them whatsoever. What they did is what I've seen in the SEAL community. They kicked the can down the road, and what they did is they kicked it down a tier to the white soft level, and allowed something that might have been cancerous to grow to an incredible position of potential leadership and sway over an organization that just doesn't happen to be theirs.
I think you're absolutely right, and you've highlighted one shortcoming. I mean, I suppose I could do a second book that's all about Delta and the Army, and maybe
I'm not recommending that at all.
No. But I'm saying it's a fair challenge. And actually, I've had a few.
I did not make that challenge. For clarity,
I've had a few readers who have communicated and reached out and said, I need to do a book about Delta.
So let me interject with one thing, because that was one thing that I didn't want to say when we were sitting down today. Is I'm not going to recommend that you go look at any other organization inside of the military, because I felt like if I said that, it would be an attempt to diffuse, or not diffuse, to deflect anything that you might have been talking about in your book. My personal assessment is that anybody who does a deep dive on any military unit, and I would go almost to the conventional level, what you're going to find is what happens after 20 years of war.
Right. It ain't pretty.
It's not pretty.
No.
And so, but the point of the one reason I wanted to avoid saying that, I'll bring it up now just so
absolutely
it's out there, is that I don't want you to write a book about Delta.
I'm not going to.
Yeah. Somebody else will. Or hopefully actually not, because what I'll tell people is that the worst things that you would never want to know about are going to be found there. So, and maybe that ties back into that level of transparency. And I don't know how to have that mechanism, but if people realize that in 20 years of war, like in any corner that you go shine a flashlight, unfortunately, you're going to find stories that are going to turn people's stomach. So maybe we should think about the commitment of human capital to these things in the future.
Yeah, that's exactly it. I just come at it from the standpoint of, I believe you shine the light so that we think twice about expending that human capital in the future.
Yeah.
It's not to punish from the standpoint of, I'm speaking here journalistically, not as my private opinion about whether I think someone who commits a crime should go to jail or not. I'm saying that as a journalist who covers this, the point is not to send people to prison. The point is to make sure it doesn't happen again, or that these things don't continue to repeat themselves over and over again.
Do you think that somebody who commits a war crime should go to prison?
Depends on the crime. I mean, it depends on what it is. It's an impossible, in a way, it's impossible to answer. I think that there should be some kind of accountability. Do I think that it is in the global, broad sense of just or unjust? I think that I agree with you that everyone should pay there should be consequences for misconduct and criminal behavior. I don't know that the answer is necessarily UCMJ or being sent to a brig. I think that it really depends on the circumstances. I do think that guys who spend this much time fighting in being asked to conduct these kinds of missions probably deserve a little bit more leeway than a E2 who is, on their first deployment in a war. But that's debatable. It's not.
Why do they deserve more leeway?
Well, because we've asked them to do more. I can
We've asked them
argue
to do more, but the law of armed conflict, the Geneva Convention, the UCMJ, it's still the same.
I agreed, and I'm not saying that they're any less culpable for what they've done. I think that, and I think certainly, the question is, what's the point here? Do we want to punish someone, or do we want to? It's sort of like the issue on criminal justice. I mean, is it going to stop the behavior? If they go to prison, if they go to a brig, is that going to stop the next guy? Or is what's going to stop them, their complete firing and losing their trident and all the other things that come with the shame of being, sort of pushed out and ending their careers, not necessarily forced out of the military, but, because we're talking about a group of people, right, who want so badly, they have worked so hard for this identity, to have achieved this goal. And if you take that away from them, it's devastating.
To some.
Well, to many, right?
Yeah.
Okay. And so that's one way to do it. I guess what I'm saying is there's no hard and fast rules. I think
it's all based on accountability, though.
Yes. And I think I also think that it's sort of like if you are an officer who witnessed something and tried to try to basically do the right thing and then walk away from that after you were browbeat both by your master chief and your superiors in the unit. I think that you should be held to more account than the E6 who was trying to, behead a guy at the end of an operation after, everyone was dead. All the target was complete. And because I think that is somehow, I think that's worse, that the lack of moral courage and abdication of legal responsibility. I mean, officers are commissioned by law, right? That's their function. We can argue about the caste system and what's appropriate and fair, but that is the system. And that's the job. And that's the job that was abdicated in too many scenarios. So I think personally, and I think my sense journalistically, reporting wise, is that would have more effect to take that 05 and say, you're done. And you're going to go to captain's mast, or, we're going to put a criminal referral in, and you may beat the charges, but you'll never come back. And you're going to have that taint you the whole way through. I think that has a real effect.
I think you have to punish both, or actually hold both accountable. And I think it's a good idea to broadly, when you talk about the officer or the E6's actions, I wouldn't even say better or worse. I think they both are held accountable to the whatever degree that they should be held accountable, because it gets tough, right? When like one, better or worse, more or less.
Right, but if you're the leader of that organization, or you're the command, and you're trying to figure out, I think that when these things happen, the first question should be, after you sort out the immediate stuff, is how did this come to be? How did these events happen? What were the circumstances that led to a deployment where U.S. servicemen, the best, most highly trained, the most skilled, the most elite, believed that terrorizing and the enemy, the adversary, was an effective way to win an unwinnable war, right? That tactically, it's eye for an eye, it's scalp for a scalp. To speaking metaphorically here, to me, it is much more concerning that festered, and that was a culture that was fostered and created and allowed to grow within a team or a troop or a squadron or a command, than the E6 who on his first deployment heard his master chief say, I want a head on a platter, and not know whether that was literal or figurative, except that in the environment in which that was expressed was very much easily understood as literal, because there was this other issue going on within the unit, and that rests, to me, again, that E6 made a very bad decision, right? And that E6, by the way, is suffering immense, as I understand. I mean, actually, something since the book has come out, people have reached out to me to
update you.
Yeah, it's and it's none of it is surprising. It's all very predictable. But the question is what's the culpability of the E9 there? that allowed that to happen? Who said that?
Yeah.
And then when it went bad, helped cover it up, make it go away, right? That is the, those are the stories that I think are the most troubling. Less the issue of what this kid was doing at the time. I'm not condoning it by any means. It's gruesome. It's gross, and so I'm just saying that you're trying to weigh. You're answering the question, what do I do? Does anyone who commits a war crime or an atrocity, should they be punished? I mean, yes, they should be punished. The question is, what is the punishment?
Yeah.
And I think that I'm trying to be realistic in answering. I'm trying to be realistic about what the military system is, what our society is. Right? Not everyone is treated the same. That is totally unfair and unjust. And you have to try to work against that and fix that. But there are realities here, right? And I think going back to what I was saying about how I really wanted to talk to Matthew Bissonnette is because what I wanted him to pick his brain on was for his insight into how the officers gamed the system, because he understands. I mean, I think most guys do, but he decided that he was going to make sure that he took advantage for himself in a way that he saw them taking advantage of. But to me, that was more important. That insight is something that is potentially really illuminating. And if you wanted to help the Pentagon or the Navy or Congress fix what's wrong with the officer corps and leadership failures in NSW, that's one of the places you'd start. You find the guy who really saw what was going on and figured out a way for him to cash in on it too, and leave aside your feelings about what he did and just focus on his knowledge and his expertise. And I think that's what I'm trying to do as a journalist, right? That's what the book is about, is like how it's absolutely the case that if SEAL Team 6 wasn't the most recognized military unit or brand, and forgive me for brand, I'm using that colloquially, that this book would be of much less interest to the public. But I did not make SEAL Team 6 what it is. And I'm responding to journalistically what Americans have an appetite for and a vision of, which is, I think, doesn't reflect reality. Parts of it are true, and parts of it should be told. And if I could write a decent sentence and could tell a good story, maybe those are the stories that I would be leaning to. So maybe the reason why I was an investigative reporter is because I'm a shitty writer.
Yeah, I think it's fair to say too that nobody at SEAL Team 6, aside from the people who have gotten out and written about their experiences, which would bring more illumination to that organization, that command itself is not trying to launch itself into the public specter either. When you have politicians openly talking about it at the highest level of government. And again, I have my own concerns about that for reasons of even the beginning edge of the funnel, the hugest part. Like, why would somebody want to come down into this organization? Is it for something that's going to go on a resume 4 to 6 years in, this unrealistic expectation of what the job actually is? What my experience at the command, like I said, it's funny you bring up Marcinko. Never met the man. Walked by him one time in a library. He had a bottle of Bombay Sapphire sitting next to him at a book signing. I'm like, fuck this. I actually didn't even know who he was at the time. Somebody else had told me. When I got to the command, he was absolutely persona non grata. And the culture that he had created was the exact opposite of what my leadership was working towards. So I have heard many times that, not a cowboy, a pirate culture, fill in the blank, and the failures in leadership and the environment where, we'll protect the brand over everything else. Man, that was my exact opposite experience at these levels. Are there instances and people inside of those organizations that fall short? There are, but I don't know where it fits mathematically. I don't think it's the norm. The failures and some of the things that you write about in the book. And like I said, I know very few people directly that you wrote about in the book. I was involved in 0% of the things that you wrote about. So a lot of it is second, third-hand information to me. But the culture that you described is not what I lived for 17 years.
It didn't ring true for you.
It didn't.
Yeah.
And it didn't ring true. I had great parents. And I grew up on a job site, all over Northern California, actually. It's where they call Santa Cruz. And the people that I was exposed to in the military, there were certainly, and I tell people this when I speak about leadership, the best leaders that I ever worked with in the SEAL community were in the SEAL community. And the worst leaders that I've ever been exposed to in my life were in the SEAL community. The SEAL community, in my experience, kicks the can down the road sometimes. And it really creates that problem when that person gets to be their own narrative. And then the next thing you know, you're like, oh shit, why are we doing this? Well, because that guy that we never dealt with is a problem. But I also was personally involved in, I think, at least 3 trident review boards where somebody slid their trident across the table. I fired an officer overseas on a combat deployment. When I saw issues, they were addressed. And it was about the standard, and it was about integrity. So, I mean, there's portions of the book that are certainly difficult to read because it almost sounds as if you feel like the core of the SEAL community is corrupt. And again, that wasn't my experience. And I can't necessarily say that's absolutely incorrect. Like I said, there were some hits in there, and I think there were some swings and misses. I almost worry, though, that it paints it in such a negative light that it could really taint people's understanding of what the occupation actually is.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's fair. I also spend a lot of time talking to SEALs, current and former SEALs, who tell me how much they discourage others from joining at this point. And
I discourage every single person I know, mostly because there's a lot of physical pain involved in the job. And I say, hey, have you looked at being a doctor? Have you looked at being an electrician? My body has a lot of miles on it, and there's a weight to the things that they ask you to do, and you can't put it down. You can deal with it. You can develop coping and management tools, stress management tools. Not all of them are healthy. There's a reason why a lot of guys are dead in their 40s.
Right.
It's tough.
I don't know how. I mean, I don't think that I have an answer to. Not that you're asking me for it. Your perspective is a totally legitimate one and is not surprising at all that there are, the majority of SEALs who have gone through the last 20 years may not recognize anything in this book. It's likely in some ways. I think what I was exposing, what I've exposed and what I've worked on is looking at and you call it the core, what I would just say is a consistent cultural problem that reared up after 9/11 in a certain way and in a very problematic way and in a way that played itself out very publicly, right? The stories about, and what happens at SEAL Team 6 ends up filtering down to the white side SEALs culturally, because SEAL Team 6 are the cool guys and what everyone wants to.
It's part of their charter as well. I mean, development group is legitimate.
Exactly by its actual purpose.
Charter.
Yes, yeah. It's what it is, and I think what I've highlighted in this book. For instance, going back to Marcinko, it's absolutely the case that in response to Marcinko, the command really professionalized. I mean, they really quickly figured out.
He sounded like he was out of his fucking mind.
But he was out of his mind.
How was the interview with him?
The interviews?
How was it?
I mean, they were amazing, actually. I mean,
Yeah.
Honestly, they were. I mean, he was a sociopath, and they're never boring at all. I mean, he's was a really interesting guy, right? The way
there's probably not a thumb drive big enough to hold all that information.
No, but what I found, and I was fortunate that I was able to interview him before he passed away, because I think it really helped me understand where he was coming from, and the thing that I think I was really surprised at and was glad that I was able that he was willing to answer the question, was he had some I would not describe it as a great self-reflection in his older years,
statesman years,
his elder statesman years, that there may have been some flaws in how he set up the unit and the way he conducted his business.
Yeah.
And the point is not to say that all of SEAL Team 6 is continues to operate as under Marcinko rules. The point is, and I think, I take what you said, your criticism of hits and misses and where I may have missed, but what I was trying to demonstrate is that this cultural characteristic, this one characteristic, not necessarily the dominant characteristic, survived. It survives. It was part of the imprint. It's part of the DNA, and it is. I don't use the term pirate culture. I've had sources who've talked about pirates. I have talked to SEALs from every generation, and it is. Speaking of describing your response as not reflecting your experience, I've had very few SEALs, retired and current, tell me anything about pirates or use that word in any way.
I mean, just Google scurvy, people. Like, it's fuck being a pirate.
But and so I think I don't think that the word choice is right. I think that the notion that frogmen were, from the big Navy standpoint, were outlaws and outliers and rogues, because within the very cut and dry system of the Navy, it's not possible to think outside of the box and come up with solutions the way, to engineer a solution to a problem that frogmen were being asked to do, right? There's a reason for it. There's a purpose there. And it's a good one, actually. And it attracts people who have, as you described, entrepreneurial, who are, this is one thing I think is, I find kind of funny about books about leadership and success, of the notion of SEAL leadership. It's not that I don't think that there aren't lessons to be learned, but my question is that, are the best leaders the ones that took a group of men who are totally self-motivated, the most self-motivated? Or is it, it's like the coach who wins, Phil Jackson was a great coach, but he always had, 3 Hall of Fame players.
Yeah, he had a group of high-performing individuals.
Exactly. Now, it is clearly an achievement to win that much. I'm just using a bad analogy.
No, I get what you're saying.
But or is it the coach who took guys who had, Jerry Brown, for instance, Brown, the coach of the Detroit Pistons in 2004, right? He took a bunch of no names, I think one guy's made it to the Hall of Fame, right? And he won the championship, and that was an incredible feat.
That's more impressive than the coach that has the high-performing athletes. However, the leadership principles are identical. And here's something that I wish people would understand. There's no such thing as SEAL leadership. There's fucking leadership. And I did a speech 2 days ago, and people will ask me, can you come teach us about SEAL leadership? And I say, no. What I can do is I can teach you about the foundational principles of leadership, what we are selecting for and then refining for throughout a career. But guess what? These are the principles that, not the SEAL teams, they didn't create them, because I was taught this by the generation before me. I was taught that by the generation before them, which was taught them that back until the times of the Romans were fucking teaching each other this stuff. And it doesn't matter if you're a used car salesman or an author, or you work at Apple, or you are an individual, or you're part of a team. There's 2 types of leadership: good, which is effective, and bad, which is ineffective. What gets people to pay attention is my background. And that's where I personally struggle with my continued connection to the SEAL community. I'm so incredibly proud of what it is that I was able to be a part of, because I read the book cover to cover, and I have no issue with what you wrote about. I can't say whether or not everything that you wrote about happened or not, because like I said, it was past my time. It didn't ring true to me as far as my personal experience. And quite frankly, at Development Group for me was my exposure to the best senior enlisted leadership and both officer leadership. But I struggle with still being associated with a Trident, and I can't escape it. So I've made peace with that, but I'm trying to move past it. And then at the same time, the internal argument is, well, if people will listen to what I'm saying, because I used to be a SEAL, but it's impactful on their life, Does it matter why it is? You know what I mean? Paying attention to me.
Yeah.
I haven't come to an answer on that one, but it's it can be taken too far though as well. And
Well, let me ask you this: what is your assessment of your community and the guys who get out, between the correlation between the guys who struggle post-military career with where being a SEAL and wearing a trident, even on their civilian clothes, is,
you see it very often,
and it's such a part of the identity. I mean, one of the things that I find interesting, I say this, this is not judgment. This is based on conversations with SEALs who were in for 30 years and their observations, and ones that I just find fascinating, is that as it's been described to me, guys who struggle, besides the normal stuff that comes with coming out from the military, there's a strong correlation between guys whose identity revolves around having been a SEAL.
Yeah.
Not that there is, and I just want to make it clear, I'm not saying there's anything wrong with that, but it is right. If you've spent 20 or 30 years with a defining identity of your life as being in this unit and wearing the trident, and when you leave, you're no longer in that system, right? The question is so my question to you is do you see any correlation with that, with guys who are, you seem, you're describing sort of struggling with whether you should feel guilty or bad about the fact that you're taking advantage of something, and I don't think you should feel bad about it. But it also, my sense is that being a SEAL is not the only thing that you see yourself as defined by.
The people who struggle the most are the ones that being a SEAL was who they were, not what they did. And I tried to, not always, successfully, remember that it's just a job at the end of the day. Nobody came out of the womb, I hope, because I don't know how this would be possible, the trident tattoo somewhere on their body. Nobody was born a SEAL. It's an occupation. It can be, for me, it felt like it was a calling. I wanted to do it since I was 11 for reasons I still can't really articulate, which I'm sure if you've talked to a bunch of team guys, it's a very common narrative inside of the community. And most guys don't understand why. Like, I don't know. It's just something I felt like I had to do. But I watch people who have gotten lost in that because it was the sole defining characteristic. And I have no judgment of people who wear like the lapel pins and whatever necklaces or rings. I mean, I have a fucking bone frog tattoo on my arm because when you turn 20, you make great decisions in your life.
I was gonna say the tattoo is no longer by choice. I mean, it was something you made a decision about.
Correct. I don't own any of those things, and I worry that people who wear those things do it for the reaction that it elicits from others. Because if you have to wear that pin so you can have that continued recognition for who you used to be, you're never going to be what you could potentially be in the future. And so I don't know the exact correlation, but what I can tell you is that the people who define themselves by, and to them being a SEAL is who they are versus what they did, they're in for a long road to hoe.
Yeah, and I think we're saying the same thing. I think it's a I think what's
leadership is the way out of that, though. Again, my experience, especially towards the tail end of my career, the senior leaders above me, like, hey, man, you got like a year before your medical retirement's going to likely go through. Why don't you spend the vast majority, like, obviously do the job, as a paperwork job anyway. Right. Do the job you need to do, but let's start focusing on what the next thing is going to be. And it was reinforced to me even when I got to Damdick, I was an E5. E5 with a collapsible sledgehammer and an M4. It was probably the best time of my life. The least amount of responsibility and wind me up and point me in the right direction. But even then, my senior leaders, like, this isn't going to last forever. And don't ever forget that. And those lessons, they stuck with me. And I have a stack of notebooks that I kept from my time in the military of things that I saw that were mistakes that I wanted to learn from other people, and things that I saw were from great leaders. And I was like, holy shit, I want to be able to emulate that and repeat what this person has done for me when I'm in that position. So you can take so much from it. It doesn't have to be who you are.
Yeah.
And I think that helps with the next. But the leadership for me is what allowed me to focus on what the next was going to be, because there's another side of that coin too. And that's long live the brotherhood forever. The only important times in your life are the times that with us right now in this group. And And I've never actually been in a brief where this was said, but I have heard of briefs like this, like we're in this together, forever. It's like, fuck, guys, this is what we put on our W-2. It's not who we are at the end of the day.
Listening to you, I was thinking that about the dissonance between your experience and then what you read in Code Over Country. And one of the things that I think is, and it's one of the reasons why it's in the book, is the Eddie Gallagher story, and covering, even though it was covered ad nauseum, and Dave Phillips did a very good job of covering it in his book, Alpha, because Eddie Gallagher didn't have anything to do with SEAL Team 6, and so in that sense it didn't fit thematically, but it did because what you were describing before about shit canning someone from a unit without telling anyone else on the other side, on the white side, why. And so they, if you chart his career, you see that same pattern, which is, and unfortunately I see it more and more now, so much so that I've had to sort of guard myself from being too cynical, that a lot of the problem children end up as instructors at Buds. And that's one of the places.
It's not a duty station that a lot of people are bucking for.
So, and by the way, at the CIA, it's the same with the instructors at the farm, right?
They don't know what to do with them, so they put them there.
They struggled in a platoon. They struggled in for various reasons, and so they send them to Buds to be instructors. And that's the charitable version, right? There's worse versions than that. So what I would say is, I'm just, you've appropriately, and this is why I came here and came on the podcast.
You just wanted to visit Montana.
All right. Like I said,
I actually wouldn't blame you for that. I'd be like, Matthew, that's a good call.
No, 2 days away from my family for a little peace and quiet, because I think that there are many issues here in which there is no set answer. There are only possibilities, and one way of trying to affect positive possibilities is, in my profession, is journalism and publishing and investigating something. And listening to you describe sort of the dissonance between what you were reading versus comparing it to your own experience is really interesting, because I think many, if not most, SEALs in your generation might have the same response in reading it. Of course, I'm not writing it for SEAL community, but of course I want to make sure, and I always fear the notion that I'm going to get someone who says, man, that's not what it's like. That's not how it was. What I would say, though, is that if you chart what happened and how Eddie Gallagher became an issue, why the Eddie Gallagher story became a controversy, there is a direct through line between the failure of leadership at SEAL Team 6 and then NSW writ large, and how you end up with an Eddie Gallagher situation where you have a platoon chief who is, by any account, off the reservation with virtually total autonomy. We don't have to debate what happened or the situation. I think that and no one involved in the Eddie Gallagher affair, from the NCIS to the prosecutors to the Secretary of the Navy, did themselves well with their performance in the Gallagher case.
It's also tough to say exactly what happened. Eddie's been on the podcast twice. The first time he was on was the first time I'd ever met him. He came on a second time, and people ask me all the time, what happened with Eddie? There's only one answer that I can give, and that's, I don't know what happened because I wasn't there.
Right. And on some level, right, we anyone who wasn't there has to accept that as some baseline. However, I'm a journalist, and it's my job to try to figure out as best I can what did happen with what's available. And to me, it's pretty unambiguous. It's pretty clear what happened in the Eddie Gallagher case. What is more interesting to me is less about what Eddie Gallagher was accused of doing versus how Eddie Gallagher, and how there was a platoon chief who was, just leaving aside everything else, on a cocktail, a drug cocktail, and a cycle of uppers, downers, and performance-enhancing drugs that was its own recipe for disaster. And that is a reality I know for a lot of guys.
I was going to say, I don't know if I know for a fact, one, I've never been, I'm terrified of needles, so prohibits me from juicing. I did try one cycle of steroids when I was in. I've been very open and honest about that. And I made some gains and fucking lost them all when you stop taking it. It's not uncommon to find guys using that stuff in the teams or in the military in general.
Right. And so what I'm saying, though, is that cocktail over increasing deployments in increasing numbers is a recipe for disaster, and Eddie Gallagher is in no way unique in terms of that situation. And I think that's one of the blinking red lights that's on right now, 20 years later, about what was allowed to occur because no one really wanted to police it. No one really wanted to talk about it. I've been spending the last several weeks actually, interviewing current SEALs, former SEALs, guys who have just come out of BUDS, several who washed out, talk about the prevalence of steroids and the specific use, the combinations, and the effects that are happening. And
it's a bad call. It doesn't actually make you better at your job.
And here's the thing, though, and I'm not going to say too much more about this because I'll wait until I actually report it and publish it.
Fine, you'll just come back. We'll do it.
But I'm going to tell you something. The scandal here is not the kids who are taking it. It's where it's coming from and who's encouraging it.
Yeah.
And I'm just look. In a lot of ways, I'm a layman. I'm a non-expert. I take the position as a journalist as someone who knows nothing and starts from the beginning. And I can tell you that when the scandal comes when the scandal comes from not from the 18-year-old making a bad decision, but from someone who knows better, who's encouraging it either directly or indirectly, you have, again, a bigger problem than just the problem that's going on at that particular training center, right? It's a bigger issue, and I think that getting into the SEALs who have told stories and written books or cashed in, it's not about the lies or distortions that they've told. It's about the allowance and acceptance by the military and the community. And by the community, I mean both the formers who will say nothing negative publicly and will dispute nothing, and but more importantly, the military, the active duty institution that reaps the benefits of the recruitment and the fame and says nothing about the lies and distortion. That problem is the same problem. It is a virus that goes from there all the way down to that kid in BUDS. And that to me is that's why I wrote the book. I think that's super important. I think it is really dangerous. I think it's hurt so many guys who have given more than just their limbs and their physical body, but their entire psyche, and the consequences that grow from it, the secondary and tertiary effects that I think are devastating. And I think that the American public has to confront it. They have to. I mean, will they? I don't know. I'm not. But and forgive me for sounding evangelical, but I think that if you don't confront it, if you don't acknowledge that it occurred, I'm not making the argument that every SEAL is bad. Far from it. I'm not making the argument that
you do use pretty broad language from time to time.
Well,
and I guess that would be one of the things that I think maybe I had that dissonance, because you speak in terms of the overall community. I don't think I can dispute what you're talking about. Like I have a suspicion that at least at some level, what you were just talking about with the kids and the steroids, and when we go offline, I'll pitch to you where I think you might be going with that, and we can leave it for a second episode. But to say that is the corruption of the entire community, for me, is a tough one to wrap my head around.
I think maybe, and this would be my failure, is to articulate better that there is a corruption that runs through it, and it has these outsized effects. And whereas the military, the Navy, and NSW and SEAL Team 6 have for 20 years and even longer said in each case these were just one-off cases of a bad apple. That simply, one of the things that, you know this more than anybody else, but the SEAL community, active duty, is so tiny, right? All white-side
creeping
SEALs,
up on like 3,000 right now, I
yes,
think.
so it's like a small ship, right? It's one ship, and then SEAL Team 6 is 300 guys, give or take, right? It's tiny. If you think about it's not a question of whether there are problems in other units and other service branches of the military. Of course there are. But the SEALs are so small and yet have such an outsized presence that I think it is earned the examination of, and it has earned the necessity of looking at and being held to, first having a mirror held up to it and saying, look, these things happened, right? These things happened, and if they didn't happen, you can, open up your books and explain to me how I've got this wrong. And they don't, and it's because they happened. And then from there, we get into how are we going to fix it? What's the public, what kind of pressure is going to come from the public to get Congress to do something about it? But it's like it's a thread that runs through, and it's not to say that the entire SEAL body is sick. It's to say that the entire SEAL body has a virus in it that it will not treat. It ignores. It pretends. So 95% of you is doing just fine and doesn't see it or doesn't feel it, right? Or can compensate for it. But it's real and it's there. And what we have now are guys who are wearing 2 and 3 stars who are, and what are we seeing? Running for office, governor, secretary of interior, right? And what are you seeing? Real ethical, some cases criminal, real ethical misconduct. And it's not a coincidence. I guess that's, I guess my little rejoinder is that it is not a coincidence that these things are happening, even if they only represent 5% of the community.
I think that the scrutiny is, here's another water for you in case you want it. It's unopened. I think the scrutiny is, even if it wasn't earned, I think it's essential that happens regardless. I think it would be easy. I think it would be easy reading the book. I got the impression reading the book that you feel that the entire SEAL community is corrupt.
Absolutely not, and absolutely not. And I think that I want to apologize to you as a reader if that's how it came off. It's certainly not my intent. I don't think that I didn't.
I'll be the first to tell you that there are aspects of the community that are corrupt. The advancement system is fucked in many ways. One of the things that I actually believe is the most broken, and this might be the military in general, but in the SEAL community, is the award system. Because oftentimes they're tied. Award and advancement are very tied. Kicking the can down the road is certainly something that I have seen. But again, I come back to those were the anomalies for me and not necessarily the norm. I have zero issue with your book. That's why I reached out to you. I do worry, though, that it does paint with that brush that the entire SEAL community is corrupt, because that just hasn't been my experience. And I'm also a product of that community. And I do everything I can, not perfectly, and I fail all the time, to live with as much integrity and purpose as I can. I learned that in the community from enlisted and officers. That would be my only criticism, I would say.
No, if that's your only, I'm disappointed if that's your only criticism. I think that the one thing
I think that the essence of what you wrote about, I think a lot of those things are very true. I think the specifics are harder to get to. I think I think that in some of the instances that you brought up, the motivations behind it might have been a little bit off. I think there's a good chance that you probably also talked to a few people that had some axes to grind.
But look, I'm actually really glad you brought that up because
Which I have no issue with.
No. Everyone has an axe to grind. And so
Yeah.
it's always the case that any version that you're hearing is through the lens where they are the hero of their own movie, right? And they dislike the person that they're describing, and they have a motivation which is not pure in telling a reporter about certain things. No investigative reporter, no reporter worth their salt is oblivious to that. And in fact, that is human nature that you have to account for. The way you account for it is triangulation, which is multiple sources over and over and over again. And of course, there are scenarios where that's the case. You really try to correct for it. And one of the ways that the best you can do as a journalist is to reach out to someone and say, here's what I was told. A, B, C. I wish, maybe what I'll do, I'll have to think through this, but I don't these. I have a list of questions that I sent to SOCOM, JSOC, and NSW years ago about events that I've reported and that are in the book for 3 of the officers who are consistently named and in great detail. And you know what the answer was? The response was nada.
That was going to be my guess.
Total silence. And this is not a case where silence equals integrity at all. And this was, if they have to answer, maybe there's something slightly wrong in what I know, but for them to correct me is only to open up to what's worse. And the one thing I was going to say is that this I know, it's like the known unknowns. I know that what I've touched in this book is just a fraction of some of the bad stuff, and that the incidents that are often highlighted are the cases that we know about because someone somewhere said something at some point. The large majority of them never got spoken about. And it is the case, it has always been my understanding that the criminal misconduct on the battlefield was, let me turn that around a little bit. I was challenged early on to say you're going to have a really hard time reporting some of this stuff out. And the reason is because there's no evidence. And the reality is that unless one guy wants to turn on his teammate and rat him out, the public will never know. And that is most of the cases. It's onesie twosies. It's guys in a room somewhere, and in the dark. I guess what I would say is that for every incident that I have in this book that I know about, how many more are there that I don't know about, or I know about but are not in the book because they're just not quite enough? And so one thing I would say is that while it doesn't ring true to you, it may be very well a result of the fact that you simply weren't exposed to it. And just because you weren't exposed to it didn't mean it wasn't going on around you. I'm not arguing that it was prevalent or that it was massive, but that's, we all, we base everything, on our own experience. And I think that, I know that this is a case of there is so much more we will never know that no one will ever talk about. And it's much worse than what's in here.
It's also a case if you go looking into the shadows and only go looking into the shadows, you're only going to find things that live there. So again, my only concern would be that people would pick up a copy of the book, which I recommend that they do. I thought it was a great read. But they think that it is enigmatic of the entire community, and that's what the SEAL community is. It's corrupt throughout the officer and enlisted leadership, and I don't.
No, it's the worst of it, and that's why the subtitle. Actually, this came up with my publisher about the subtitle. It's Code of Our Country: The Tragedy and Corruption of SEAL Team 6, and one of my thoughts about a subtitle was The Secrets of SEAL Team 6, and it was also my idea to do tragedy and corruption, but my publisher insisted that the word tragedy be in the subtitle, and it need to be the first word in the subtitle because it needed to convey that the tragedy here is that this stuff is going on and there has gone on and there's been no accountability. Not that, in other words, it's not a prosecution. This is, I'm not trying to prosecute anyone journalistically. I'm trying to lay out an environment of a sequence of serious incidents and a narrative that is much broader than just one deployment or even one war, and say, this has to be addressed. So, it may not have worked. You may disagree with it. But it's not meant to be, I hope no reader buys this book thinking about or concludes that it is meant to portray all SEALs or even most SEALs. It doesn't at all. But it is a significant minority. And unfortunately, just as the loudest ones are the ones who tell the least true stories, there's a correlation there. I guess what I'm saying is similarly, the worst stuff may be a minority, but they ended up at the top running things, and that is a corruption.
Sometimes, in some places,
I think if you look right now at the spectrum of flag officers who are SEALs, you will see a preponderance of SEAL Team 6 from a particular era.
Yeah.
And
that's the timeline that's going to be ascending.
Exactly. And so the problem is all of the junior officers who cut their teeth under those officers are ascending now. And so there is a second generation that learned a lot of the wrong leadership lessons about how to conduct themselves as officers. And that's actually the problem. That's actually the issue, right? If you were going to try to solve this, the real solution would be there would be an entire generation of officers that you basically said no more career advancement. We're not going to fire you. We're not. But that's your Truth and Reconciliation Commission. The Navy says everyone who touched this space is done. They finish when their service is up. Because that's the problem. That's how a small virus continues to replicate.
Well, one good thing is that a 2-star sitting up on high, breathing their rarefied air, doesn't have shit to do with what happens on target. So trust me, when I see caller devices like that, I go the other direction. And they would come by and they would want to chat, but they're never on target. And nothing that they said to me ever had anything to do with how I conducted myself on target. It was my direct enlisted superior, the troop commander. I was thinking about. I can't remember if we called ourselves teams or squadrons. I left in.
Well, you were right on the edge.
I swear we called ourselves both interchangeably.
Yeah,
it's irrelevant, but it was pissing me off that
Well, because when you got there, it was teams, and when you left, it was squadron.
So yeah, I'd heard them both. It was just pissing me off that my memory had failed. But at no point in time somebody at 2-star has anything to do with what's happening on target. They could maybe point the vehicle in the direction that would, I don't even know if they could do that. Maybe from a policy perspective. But as far as the actions that you write about in the book, a 2-star is not going to have any impact on that unless it hits their desk and they do nothing about it.
No, right. But what I'm saying is that so for every 2-star that was involved with or encouraged or a product of the leadership failures, every one of those officers had X number of junior officers
working underneath them, and the lessons that they learned, they bring up, right? The problem... That's assuming they agree with those lessons. The best teachers in my life when it came to leadership were poor examples of leadership.
Sure, but what do we know about the military writ large, which is flags promote in their own image, by and large. That is the political jockeying.
When you get up to that level, I've always said this, and I don't know if it's true, but once you get to the flag level, which for the Navy, and I think it's the same for all of them, is the 1-star. And so the Navy, that's a jump between captain to flag. You're a politician. You're no longer an actual member of the military.
Right, but if you're an O5 hoping to make O7, you are making decisions about what you think are going to land you in the best position to make that that rank. And what I'm saying is that if you wipe out an generation, if you basically cut off the head of an entire generation of now mid-career officers who were junior officers during the wars, you're sending a message for everyone that comes behind them that this is what's, you want to advance, this is not how to do it.
Yeah, it goes back to the accountability piece.
Right.
But you wouldn't be allowed to let them stay. You'd have to eject them from the military.
The details could be worked out.
Yeah.
The point is there has to be a forgive the saying, a bloodletting, if you will. There has to be, and I think that that is a missing component over the last 20 years. People make mistakes. When 2019, I think there was the commanding officer and the master chief and maybe the OPSO from SEAL Team 7 were shit canned, right? And they had a lawsuit.
I vaguely remember that.
It came around at the same time as the Gallagher court martial, and it came as a result of several things, but including the platoon that got kicked out of.
They were drinking in Iraq, right?
They were drinking in Iraq, and there was an allegation of sexual assault, and they were relieved and sent home. And when
CO, XO, and Master Chief, right?
Yes, I believe that's right. I know for sure the CO and the Master Chief. I believe it was the XO.
And so for people listening, at the teams, commanding officer is the highest up, executive officer, then you have the Master Chief and the OPSO. That's like that would be a diamond.
It's the head shed.
It's the head shed. I'm trying to think of the geometric turn. It's fucking square on its side. After every 2 years, that's largely the 4 people that rotate out. So when there's a change of command, that's largely what it is. So if those 4 people were removed, like you said, that's cutting off the head of the command.
Right. In 20 years, I am aware of no such relief of command in the SEAL teams. Now, either everyone was flawless or they were soft on accountability.
Or the issues didn't rise to the level where leadership above them thought it was necessary to do so.
Or leadership above them didn't know about it. That's
fair.
And that's one of the arguments that, one of the things that I'm trying to what's in the book are the things that were repressed and suppressed from going further up the chain.
What do you hope the book achieves? What would be success in your viewpoint?
In a modest way, I hope that this will help the Navy, the military, the SEAL community think about how they need to conduct themselves in terms of leadership and have some internal accountability, sort of looking themselves in the mirror and taking stock. I think writ large, I really hope that this book can encourage the public and civilians and politicians to think about the costs of, because I think these are things that happen, the bulk of this is what happens when you send people off to war for 20 years and you send an even smaller group to do it more than everybody else. And you don't, no one starts out that way, right? No one sent them, we didn't start that way, but it's where we've ended up. And so if, my hope is that by shining a light in the really dark spaces that have been hidden, that we're forced to confront, what can happen, and think about that and use that going forward to prevent it from happening again in another similar situation. And that may sound, it's a little broad, and it is, I'm trying to be realistic. With the fact that, ultimately I'm trying to make using journalism to affect some positive change, on an issue that I think is important for the American public. I think that I don't expect, I think it's appropriate and it's natural and it is to continue that the U.S. public enjoys and eats up its military stories. that's a normal, that it's true in every society.
It just can't be taken too far.
Well, I think that I think that sometimes you need a market correction, if you will. And, I think.
So we need some Green Beret stories, is what you're saying.
Yeah, there weren't enough of those after Vietnam. Some of these stories are universal in that way, right? It's just a market correction, and it's the truth. It may not be. I mean, I think that this book reflects a more accurate accounting of SEAL Team 6 than what has been in the public to date. And that is because it focused on the problems rather than all of the successes. And getting back to the question you asked earlier about what I meant about the good SEAL books, is I just meant the ones that are totally flattering and then, as a result, err on the side of myth. And it
They
serves
also
no
don't
purpose.
do a good job of actually telling my understanding of what the story is of that command.
But that's the point. That's what your point about letting stories that are untrue fester. It gnaws at it gets at the integrity, the overall integrity down the line.
Yeah.
And so this is a course correction for that. And I think, in some cases there are events in here that are very well known. And it's I think as a journalist, I was really fascinated to discover or come to certain events like the Lone Survivor incident and Chris Kyle stuff from the perspective of SEAL Team 6 operators and SEAL Team 6 leaders who were observing it at the time and trying to measure it. And that's one that is, again, going back to providing, the other thing I would say, this is, I hope what this book achieves is bringing some realistic context to what the world of special operations forces looks like. And that doesn't mean that it speaks for everyone or all of it. It's meant to highlight the bad stuff because it's more than just one bad apple that requires its own scrutiny and requires a book, I think. But it is, I hope, a market correction. I think we've gone too far over, and I by the way, I think the public is ultimately bears the most responsibility for that, right? We love these stories, no offense, but when you write a book or you've got books, someone thinks that you're going to make money selling a book about hero SEAL dogs, and I'm not denigrating.
I haven't read that one.
I'm not denigrating the dogs or their service. No, I'm serious. But
does this book actually exist?
Yes, there is an entire book written.
Let me just tell you, I'm not exactly on the pulse of all the SEAL books that come out because I can't go to the library every fucking day.
Well, there is a book that is written about the SEAL dog that served on the bin Laden mission and written by his main handler. And to me, rather than being critical of it, to me reflects the unending appetite that the public
Insatiable
has.
palate.
Yes, of the public. And I don't think that's healthy. And again, I haven't read that book. I'm not criticizing that book whatsoever.
Yeah.
Although if it's not true, and there are parts of it that are untrue, I think someone absolutely should journalistically write that up and report it. But that's not my brief.
I'm going to skip that book, Matthew. I want to read to you a paragraph from here. We've been at this shit 3.5 hours.
Really? I feel like I've been here for about an hour.
I wanted to read a paragraph to you.
Okay.
Like I said, I enjoyed reading the book. I felt like there were some swings and there were some misses. If everything that I read in this book, it came down to this paragraph. So I have a question for you after this paragraph for me. And not, let me take that back. This paragraph stuck out to me, not in a standalone. There have been and this is in let me make sure this is in the epilogue. It's page 313. There have been very few reform efforts, if any, and the ones that may have happened have not been made public. A surprising outcome given all the books about leadership and character written by the SEALs themselves. Given my decade of reporting on the SEALs, I know just how entrenched the problems are. But I also know that change is possible and what it might look like. The culture and code of silence and deceit can be eradicated, but it requires ultimately that the SEALs face what they already know to be true about what has occurred in Afghanistan, Iraq, Somalia, Yemen, and beyond, and admit they betrayed their duty to their country. My question for you would be, I know for a fact that there are surviving family members of SEALs who will probably watch the podcast and do listen to the podcast. That's an example of where I think you maybe went a little bit too broad in the description of the language, but what would you say to those families when you write a book and there's a paragraph in it like that where you feel that those service members should admit that they failed their country?
I think what I would say is, and listening to it, what I'm expressing there and saying there is what needs to be admitted are the problems in the teams. Not that everyone who is in the teams is responsible for it, but the silence and the unfortunately, the guilt by association, in a sense, is a very powerful power is not the right word. It is the fact that the SEAL community, retired, current, will not speak out about the problems that have gone on, the stories that have become public and told that are dishonest, but most importantly, for those who know, who are aware of misconduct, serious issues, who say nothing, that is a disservice to everyone. And what I do mean this, a betrayal of the values of, and maybe that was the missing word, is the betrayal of the values of the country.
Of that individual's values, I would say, not the community as a whole.
No, the values that they are meant to, anyone who wears the uniform and takes a oath is meant to uphold, which is a protection of the values that are ingrained in the Constitution. And that is, I think, and that's actually where the title comes from, which is that there is this code. It is a code of silence around anything that makes the teams look bad or the community look bad or the unit bad. And it is put in front of what is supposed to be happening, which is, we use these terms, defending our freedoms, right? And we can argue about whether fighting the Taliban in year 17 is defending American freedom or...
It's not. I talk about this one all the time.
Okay, but what I'm saying is that what I think is a betrayal, this code, is that it's a betrayal of what are the values and of what our democracy is. And that, I think, is actually, you've underlined, and I understand you may not, that may have been a point where I was maybe a little too strident, although I think that I stand behind it. Mm-hmm. And to answer your question, what would I say to the family members? Is it those who have served or those who have lost loved ones?
When I was reading it, what stuck out to me is the sacrifice. And it's the last part of it. Admit they betrayed their duty to their country.
Maybe when I say they, I'm referring to SEALs who know what happened, what went wrong, what's being hidden. Not the SEALs who, look, I can't.
I agree with you on that statement, by the way.
But I can't blame someone who doesn't know something for not doing something. I think I'd have to look at the paragraph before, but I know that in the epilogue, one of the points that I was trying to make, and I think in the epilogue I explicitly made, is that the stories that are in the reporting that's in this book are not secret inside the SEAL teams and in the SEAL community. And so someone may not have firsthand knowledge of something, but they certainly know that many of these stories that we're talking about happened and the way they were covered up and much smaller versions of those things that happen that they do know about. I mean, I get these stories literally all the time from SEALs.
I think it's highly dependent. Like, for example, the Ensign Penny thing, I had never heard about that.
No. That's a generational thing.
Yeah.
But everyone from his era who came in at his time
Probably had.
they all, especially the officers, knew.
Even
So-
a lot of some of the stuff you were talking about, the Dam Neck stuff, I had never heard about.
And I'm not suggesting, again, that, it may be that your experience simply, you were very lucky that you were not exposed to any of it, but it didn't mean it wasn't happening while you were there. But I want to answer the question. What I would say to the family of those who have served is that the betrayal is in the values, in American values, and what are supposed to be upheld, which are the principles of the Constitution and the Constitution itself. And it is any, what's the best way to describe this? I think that silence is complicity, is what I'm trying to get at, and that your loved one may have no knowledge about whatsoever, in which case I'm not speaking to them or about them. But a lot of people in the community, and it's a tiny community, knew a lot of stuff and have never said anything. Now, the book is a result of people who did try to do things. Some cases were successful, often cases failed. And so I didn't go seeking out to tell this story. There were people who wanted this story from inside the community to be told. And I guess that's how I would answer it. It's not a clean answer, I guess, but it's maybe they was a little too broad. It should have been a little more precise. But
That's my only concern with the book, is that people think that it is a overarching description of the entire SEAL community. And I don't think there is a book possible to be written for clarity that could cover all those bases.
Oh, of course not. And I think that the focus was on SEAL Team 6 and the way the problems inside SEAL Team 6 filter down to the rest of the SEAL community, and the origins of some of those problems at SEAL Team 6, which predate the existence of SEAL Team 6. And I think that if you silence is complicity. I think that it's a real problem. It's no different than a blue wall of silence and a code of silence in a police department, right? Where you cover up for your buddy even when you know it's wrong. It eats at the integrity. And my point is that for everyone who has knowledge of that, who doesn't do anything about it, it's a problem. And it is a betrayal of American values. It's certainly a betrayal of what we're supposed to have in a democracy. And it's unfortunate. It doesn't mean, and again, the other thing is that it doesn't mean, going back to something I said, I'm not saying that these are bad men doing good things. I'm saying good men can do bad things too. And it doesn't mean you're a bad person or,
There's plenty of bad people in the SEAL community.
But what I'm saying is that that is a tension that exists that I think needs to be accepted, is that there are good men doing bad things, or good men who have done bad things, and there are bad men who've done good things, and they mix together, and they're sitting in that unit. And that's the reality, and it's unfortunate. And I don't know that I know everything I don't know how to properly answer the question, which is a really good one.
Here's what I'll tell you, and one of my favorite quotes that I've tried to live by, and I learned this from, he was an E7 at the time at the unit. What you tolerate in your presence is your standard. And that has been a guiding principle for me since I heard that. And I'm not perfect by any stretch. I can be a complete and utter fuckwit at times. But in the moments that matter, I hope that I have lived up to that. Because it comes back to accountability. Seeing something and saying nothing about it, I agree with you. Silence is being complicit. I'll be the first to tell you that there's problems inside of the SEAL community. I think I would probably push back on how widespread that they are, and maybe even how they necessarily, their origin story is. But I couldn't agree with you more. If there are people, and for anybody who happens to listen to this, if you're in a situation where you see something going on and you're not doing something about it, then fuck you. I mean, that's how I land on it. I'm not speaking for you. That's my own colorful language. But accountability matters and integrity matters. And I learned that in the SEAL community and at that command as well. So I will let you close it out, Matthew. Like I said, we have now been at it for 3 hours and 45 minutes. I can't thank you enough for making the time. To be honest,
I'm really grateful, Andy, to be invited on here. I'm really grateful to be asked tough questions and that you are challenging me and issues in the book. That's what it's there for. It means that we're having a conversation, which I think has been long overdue. Not just in your community and background, but in the public in general.
Yeah.
And so I'm really grateful. I hope that, this conversation will lead some people to pick up the book and read it and think about it. Maybe they will, maybe they won't. It's been a real pleasure. It's a lot of pressure to close out. I've never closed out a podcast before, and so I don't know.
After today, you're not going to be able to say that. It doesn't have to be anything incredible.
I thought you were going to say after today you'll never have a podcast again, and that may be true too.
People need to be able to sit down and have a conversation.
Yeah,
like this.
yeah.
And that's why, like I said at the beginning, I got so many messages. You need to have this guy on the podcast. And I was just fascinated. I wish I could reach out to that person and say, why is it so important to you that I do? What do you think? I don't, first off, have any secret sauce. I mean, I have my own experience. And one thing, the SEAL community is super tiny, but if you don't work directly with the people, it might as well be 50,000 people. I mean, I ended at Team 3. I knew like a couple guys at Team 1 and then a couple over at 5 and 7. And I barely knew the people that I worked directly with incredibly well. So it is tiny, but it's vast at the same time period. But I don't know. If people reached out and thought that you and I were going to be screaming at each other across the table, I don't think that's how we move the rock forward.
Andy, I think you've created an amazing safe space here for us. I haven't been triggered once.
I hope so.
I think that for me, the one of the great things about being able to having the privilege to write a book, publish a book, and then go out and talk about is that this is as a journalist, I'm forever learning. I am literally forever learning. And, there are, that high, I'm probably going to think about that paragraph now for the next 6 months. And
don't think it's just a paragraph that completely damns the SEAL community and everybody that's in it. That's
just a tiny little thing. It's just don't notice it. No, I think that I try to improve. I try to not internalize these things, but be better at. And I think there's one word in there that I think it was missing. One word that off, and that's a failure of writing at some point. And I is not potential purchasers of my book. It is not indicative of the rest of the book.
I said, I recommend people pick up your book, and maybe, since we haven't talked about it once, that's the best ending. Where can they find it?
Oh my God! Apparently,
we suck at marketing. Your publisher would be like, "You're terrible."
I don't even want to get into it. My father just told me yesterday that he ordered the book when there was a Barnes and Noble sale that they had pre-publication, and my dad's always looking for a cheap way, always wants to spend a little less. So
just robbing you of your royalty.
So he got it. He got it. He ordered it, but the problem is for whatever reason, Barnes and Noble's had a lot of problems with their supply chain, and so he did not get a copy of the book for like 3 weeks. I had to send him one. I didn't know this. I sent him one myself with a note, and then he called me up and said, thanks for sending me the book. It's the first copy I've actually got. So I won't tell you to go to barnesandnoble.com. I will tell you that Barnes and Noble physically has them, but of course Amazon is, the main purveyors. It is. I will say.
Do you have an audio as well?
Audio, ebook,
okay,
everything. Yeah, the audio voice actually. Was one fun thing that I did was sift through the guys who did the voices.
The only candidate should be James Earl Jones.
Oh, do you know that this is totally off subject, but my sister-in-law, when she graduated college, James Earl Jones was the commencement speaker.
Are you serious?
It was amazing.
She had Darth Vader as the commencement.
It was amazing. He had an incredible message, but the best part, of course, was at the end, he said, and of course, may the force be with you. He said nothing else prior to.
You have to quit your life at that point because that is the peak.
I was standing.
It's all downhill.
I was in the very back, and, I was like, if this man pulled out a phone book and just read the names, I'd be here.
Oh, yeah.
I'd pay for it.
Yeah.
For that voice. Anyway, that's my James Earl Jones story. That's how I'll end this podcast. Buy the book. It's at Amazon. It's at Barnes & Noble. It's, at your local bookstore. But I really, really appreciate you having me on, Andy. This has been a real pleasure.
It's been awesome. Thank you very much.